It's a cold December morning in the Florida Panhandle. 31-year-old Mike Williams heads out from his Tallahassee home to go duck hunting on Lake Seminole.
Generally, when you go duck hunting, you're up early. You're getting out there before the ducks start flying. So he left really early. To drive to where he was going was approximately an hour drive, somewhere in that range. Mike had a wife, Denise, and they had a fairly new baby girl. She was about 18 months old. The plan was he was to come back that day. It was their anniversary with his wife, Denise. They were to go down to Apalachicola, Florida, and stay the weekend there.
I went for a walk, and when I got back that afternoon, my older son, Nick, was crying, and he said, "Mom, Denise called, and they can't find Mike." And I said, "What do you mean they can't find Mike?" And Denise told us that she called her daddy, and her daddy called a friend of theirs, and they drove out to Lake Seminole to see if they could find Mike, and all they could find was his truck.
I was an FWC officer, Fish and Wildlife. Had just arrived home from a trip and was scheduled to go to work around 6 o'clock that day. And they called and asked me if I could to come on out, that they needed some assistance with the missing duck hunter on Lake Seminole. When I arrived there were friends and family members out on the lake already searching for the individual.
Mike's preference was to go with somebody, but he did hunt alone, simply because he couldn't arrange times where people could do it. Denise would know where he was. Golly, it just didn't seem right for Mike to be missing like that.
Mike was the kind of child that was always in a hurry. He never walked, he ran. My husband, Jerry, was a Greyhound bus driver. I had home daycare so that I could be at home with Michael and Nick. Jerry and I were not millionaires by any means, but, we were comfortable. I wanted them to get a good education, so we sacrificed and sent them to private school. Michael was involved in anything that he could be involved in. Sports was his big thing, and he was the class president. Michael was a good, honest person. He always worked for everything he got.
I was about 10 years old when I met Mike. He had the best heart of anyone that I've ever met. Very funny, just an all-around good kid. I remember the day he sat on my bed and told me about Denise Merrill. Oh my gosh, he was so excited. There was an aura about this couple. I think it's kind of like out of the movies where the football player is with the cheerleader.
He met Denise Merrill the first day of the 9th grade. I think it was love at first sight. She told me that I knew when I met Michael that I was going to marry him. She loved Michael. Michael ended up graduating with a degree in political science and city planning. He went to work for Clay Ketchum, a real estate appraiser.
Mike Williams was as clean as anybody comes. He did his job. He took care of his family. He only wanted the best for other people. He wanted to be a successful person.
Mike and Denise got married on December 17th, 1994. It was beautiful. Denise was a beautiful bride. Michael was real nervous, handsome. On May the 8th, 1999, Mike and Denise had a daughter. His heart just went right to her. He was the best father in the world.
As the sun sets over Lake Seminole, investigators looking for Mike Williams face a grim scenario. They found a truck and trailer, but there's no sign of the 31-year-old father or his boat.
We brought in the helicopter because we're talking a 30,000-acre lake.
I was a wildlife officer for the state of Florida, stationed in Jackson County. Mr. Williams could have easily have hit a stump, and his boat was small, and it could have thrown him out of the boat very easily, and the boat would have set back up.
Lake Seminole has a large amount of vegetation under the surface, so there was a possibility he could have gotten tangled up in some of this vegetation.
Because Mike Williams' boots are found in the vehicle, Officer Arnett is able to determine that Williams had been wearing rubber waders when he left in his boat.
When someone falls into water with the waders on, the pressure of the water pulls and sucks to your skin, and it's extremely tough. It's almost impossible to get those waders off. It would pretty much take you to the bottom.
There was a lot of people there. One of the first people that were out there looking was Mike Williams' best friend, and that was Brian Winchester.
Brian Winchester met Michael the first day of the 9th grade at North Florida Christian School. Michael and Brian had the hunting in common, and they became really, really good friends. They went hunting all over the country. Michael loved Brian.
During the search, he said to me numerous times, "I can't be here when they find Mike's body." And I said, "I understand, I don't want to be here either."
Brian had found the boat. He and his father was in the search party, and they had located the boat themselves.
The location of the vessel was not far from the landing where he launched. I found a shotgun in a case. I found decoys, life jackets, and the contents indicated that he wasn't in the process of hunting at the time because of his gun being cased.
There was no mud in the boat. There was no telltale signs of a hunter. You know, I mean, you get wet and you get muddy and you get stuff in the boat. None of that was apparent. We all just looked at each other like, what? This is making no sense at all. I just had a feeling Mike was gone. He was gone from the earth.
The news of Mike Williams' disappearance on December 16th, 2000, spreads quickly through the Tallahassee community.
I started working at the station after Mike Williams' initial disappearance.
Powered by WCTV.tv.
Michael Williams disappeared while duck hunting.
Our Lenitra Bennett joins us live with more. Lenitra.
I was a big part of covering many of the follow-up stories.
And never came home.
To hear that a grown man set out one early morning to go hunting, and then for him to not come home, that just doesn't happen often.
One day after Mike Williams mysteriously vanishes while duck hunting, investigators zero in on his empty boat, which had been found in the early morning hours.
The first thing that I did when I got to the vessel, I took that gas cap off, and the gas was all the way to the top. And I thought in my mind the motor didn't run long, and if it had hit a stump, there should have been some bark on the propeller, but it was clean. After the first day, we basically said, hey, where this boat's located at, he has to be in this water.
Because the case is considered a possible drowning with no evidence of foul play, the investigation is handled by Fish and Wildlife, with search support from the Jackson County Sheriff's Department. 15 boats, with the aid of a helicopter, find no other trace of Mike Williams.
About the third day, I got to thinking, what's going on here? Why haven't we found this person?
Mike's wife, Denise, is beside herself.
Denise didn't want to be out there, and so we went over to see Denise. She came down the stairs and literally collapsed into my arms. She was emotionally distressed, sobbing. We were trying to be optimistic at that point in time, saying, well, you know, we're going to find him. And she was going, yeah, we're going to find him.
It was Christmas Eve before I went to the lake. I'm standing on this little board out in the water, and this voice comes to me just as clear as a bell. And it said, Mike is not in Lake Seminole. You have to find him and bring him home. So I thought that Michael was alive.
The 10th day, we were the first boat on the water, and we started our grid search. And I noticed something floating on the east side of the deeper hole. I was still 35, 40 yards away from it. But we got there and we noticed it was a hat floating in the hydrilla.
The hat is identified by one of the volunteers, Mike's longtime friend, Brian Winchester.
Brian Winchester had brought a photograph of himself and Mike Williams, and we were able to confirm that the hat belonged to Mike Williams.
With still no sign of Mike, a disturbing new theory emerges.
There's alligators on Lake Seminole. Yes, there is. Hundreds and hundreds. People from the community were saying, well, alligator may have gotten him and put him under a log.
I was always afraid that an alligator would get him. And he would tell me, alligators sleep when the water's cold. And we only hunt ducks when the weather is cold.
When I heard the alligator theory, I just thought that did not happen because I had knowledge of what alligators do during the cold weather.
So what did happen to him? If he's not alive, but he went out in the water, what are the possibilities? What happened to Mike Williams?
We'd searched hard from daylight till dark, and the search got down to about every 3 days.
I didn't know what to do. It was always, Miss Williams, he drowned and alligators ate him. They wouldn't come off of that story. So I was at a loss.
I didn't feel like there was any foul play involved in this, but Officer Renew, he basically every week would go to the lake for quite a period of time.
I think it was June 2nd. A friend of mine knocked on my door and said, hey, I found a pair of wader boots floating in Lake Seminole. I went with him, and we found the boots floating.
2 days later, when a jacket is recovered, investigators find a hunting license issued to Mike Williams inside the pocket.
And a little bit after that, the judge in Tallahassee made a determination that Mike Williams was dead and signed a death certificate on him.
That motion was using the fact that the waders and the jacket with his hunting license were found in the water there where they were looking.
With Mike Williams declared legally dead, there's no more heat to support pursuing the case further. Authorities consider the case closed.
And it'd be a cold case at that time. You know, especially when we didn't have a body. I really, really felt sorry for Miss Cheryl. Really did. It just broke my heart.
I learned about the death certificate from Brian Winchester. Brian stopped me in his truck and he said, "Well, I guess you're surprised that they declared Michael dead so quickly." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, no, Brian, not with the way that evidence just popped up out of the clear blue." And he said, "What do you mean, Miss Williams? That was a gift from God." I said, "Brian, I've had gifts from God. That was not." I said, "I think those waiters were planted."
Denise never wanted to go out to the lake. Never wanted to go until that 1-year anniversary. My wife took her out there and showed her where the site was. Denise got out of the car. She had some flowers. They walked up to the water. Denise stood there for quite a while and then laid the flowers into the water. It seemed like she was trying to move on.
It's been nearly 6 months since Mike Williams was declared dead by accidental drowning. The search for his body has come to a halt, but not everyone agrees with the official cause of death.
We never found the body. I've never had to search for a body that we didn't find. If they were in the water, we would find them. When we found the waders floating, it's not what we would have expected to see on waders after 6 months.
We visually searched the waders inside and out for any indication of deteriorating body parts in the waders, any markings where an alligator had bitten them.
Secondly, they would have had thick layer of slime so much that you probably couldn't even pick them up. There was no slime. My thoughts were, you know, this stuff has been staged out there and he's not in this body of water.
Cheryl Williams never accepted the fact that he could have been dead. She would constantly tell us that she believed in her heart that he was still alive.
Mike Williams' mother telling WCTV she had hope.
Until God tells me in my heart that that child is dead, I cannot give up looking for him.
Back to you guys.
She felt like that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement should investigate it. She didn't really have any power other than just herself.
A friend of mine took pictures of Michael and put them on missing person cards, and then we had them printed out in the print shops. We nailed them to trees, we nailed them, took them all to all the cities around Tallahassee.
She put up billboards all over town for him. I would be driving to work and I would go over the flyover and I would look up and see the sign, you know, and it was just a constant reminder that he's no longer here.
There were a lot of people that were not happy with Miss Cheryl for continuing to push it. I think there were some people that felt like this is done. They found the waders, they found the jacket, the death certificate, it's over.
I made up a big picket sign that said, "My son is missing, please help me find him." I would go to all the different churches on Sunday, but whenever I would try to get FDLE or somebody to look into the case, it was, "Miss Williams, alligators ate Mike. There's nothing criminal about that. We can't do anything about that." I fought. I wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters. I finally got my criminal investigation in February of 2004.
Cheryl's persistence pays off. Authorities from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement finally decide to open a file on Mike's case.
When I finally got my criminal investigation, I prayed to God. I said, God, please send somebody who can talk to the police and back up what I've said.
Investigators go back to the very beginning, interviewing people involved in the initial search one by one.
So I got the case in 2005. There wasn't a lot going on in 2005 with it. It always seemed like there's something else going on here. There's something that is right under the surface we're not seeing. Cold cases are special. They're different from the other cases. Most cases you're out there investigating. Soon after it happened, you're following leads, and it's a fresh trail. When you're working these, you're looking for something you missed. When I picked up the case, what stood out was one friend, and that was Brian Winchester. Brian shows up and finds the boat. Well, that was interesting. You had people up and down all over the place. Nobody found the boat.
But Brian Winchester knew where it was at.
And when the hat was found by the officers on the lake, Brian Winchester identified that hat as Mike Williams' hat.
I'm like, well, that's kind of a coincidence. The percentages and the odds are just really curious. So then we start to look a little deeper. We found out this insurance policy for $1 million. Brian wrote this.
Brian Winchester put out an insurance policy on Mike for $1 million just before Mike Williams disappeared.
The age-old adage is follow the money. Where's the money? What's the motive? Why would this happen to Mike?
Brian Winchester, an insurance salesman working for his father's company, had written a $1 million policy on Mike Williams just months before Williams vanished.
There was a lot of stuff that pointed fingers at Brian. You had Brian finding all the evidence, which was just odd. You had the insurance money. Mike wanted to make sure if anything ever happened that his family was taken care of. He had a $250,000 policy, I think through work, and then opened a $500,000 policy. Now, Brian Winchester's father had an insurance company. There's some encouragement from Brian. And all of a sudden, Mike Williams got another $1 million policy written by his friend Brian Winchester.
While it's not unusual that Denise Williams would be listed as the beneficiary, the timing of the policy raises suspicion, especially because following Mike's disappearance, Brian and Denise have become more than friends.
As time went on, Denise was trying to move on, and she started dating other people, and then ultimately started dating Brian Winchester.
Brian and Denise did not get together immediately. Denise dated, there were a few guys that she dated, and Brian had a divorce in 2003.
My older son, Nick, got married in September of 2004. Denise and Brian both came to the wedding and told us that they were dating.
When Brian and Denise get married on December 3rd, 2005, and decide to keep living in Mike's house, it raises eyebrows among the community.
We thought for sure that if they were going to forge a new relationship, that they would get out of that house and start a new beginning, just because of the memories of Mike. But they set up in Mike's house. It did seem odd to us.
Investigator Sparkman also suspects that something else may be brewing between the newlyweds.
All of a sudden, the guy that wrote the $1 million policy is married to the woman who's benefiting from Mike Williams' death. That led to another suspicion. Maybe both Denise and Brian were involved in Mike's disappearance. But it wasn't enough there to say we're able to bring charges. You're following leads, and you kept waiting for a flare-up, waiting for something to show up. It's a hard place to be in. We had suspicion, we had suspicious activity. We never had quite enough evidence to get a search warrant for the house.
With no solid evidence, and only a lingering suspicion that Brian Winchester is somehow involved in Mike's disappearance, the case turns to ice. 5 more years go by without any answers for Cheryl Williams.
I kept Michael's name and his picture in the public. Michael was my child, and there was nobody else out there to speak for him but me.
These cold cases will sit 5, 6 years because we don't have many options left anymore. But you've got a box. I got a box that says Mike Williams on it. It followed me to all the different offices I went to. And we'd hear of arguments, we'd hear of issues going on for Brian and Denise. We're just keeping an eye on them, waiting for one to crack. That's when somebody's going to be willing to come forward and say, hey, I got something I need to tell you. Then Brian and Denise separated. Denise is very stoic, very keep it all together. But this is just starting that vortex for Brian that's sucking him down, taking him deeper and deeper, and just continual piling on top of all the stressors in his life.
After 4 years of nothing to advance the case, investigators finally get the spark that heats things up.
Denise gets into her vehicle. She's starting to back out of her driveway. Brian's hiding in the back of her Suburban and climbs over the back seat with a gun and says, hey, I need you to go here and here. And he's telling her where a place to go out in the woods. She starts driving. Instead of going to where he says she drives, she makes another turn and pulls into one of the drugstore parking lots. Denise is trying to convince him, hey, what are you doing? He's stressed about the divorce, the pending divorce and everything going on. She's trying to tell him, hey, just calm down. Everything will be all right, whatever she has to say. So he gets out of the car. When Brian exited the vehicle, he grabbed a backpack. He had the pistol. He also had a couple spray bottles, tarp. It was all a configuration of a kit to dispose of a body. All of a sudden, I think it kind of hit Denise that, oh, he was really fixing to do something.
All right, what's your name?
Denise Winchester.
All right, just give me a rundown on what happened today.
When Denise shows up at the Leon County Sheriff's Office to report a harrowing account of being kidnapped at gunpoint by her estranged husband, Brian Winchester, it's the opening detectives need to resolve Mike Williams' case.
I got a call from the other investigators I work with from FDLE that said, hey, something's going on. And Denise, she's in the interview room, and everybody said, okay, this is the crack we've been waiting for.
I was just kind of agreeing with whatever he was saying. And I was like, I know that you love me.
Everyone knows the situation. They call one of the investigators from FDLE. They start talking to her about what went on that morning. Well, then he gets an opportunity to step in and ask,
Do you think he's responsible for Mike's disappearance?
I do not, and I never have. I would have never married him if I thought that.
Where do you think Mike's buried at?
Oh, I have no idea.
She just kind of shuts down and quits talking to him. But there's enough there with an aggravated kidnapping to put Brian in jail. So on August 5th, 2016, Brian was arrested for aggravated kidnapping with a firearm. He's looking at 30 years or better on a sentence. So Brian goes to jail, and everybody said, this is the situation that's going to lead to find out what happened to Mike. Knowing that he's looking at 30 years or better is a pressure point. He didn't want to be there. It was a tough on him.
We went to the sentencing because we were hopeful that there'd be some revelation of what happened to Mike, that Brian would say something in open court.
At Brian's sentencing, Denise pleads with the judge to give him the maximum time behind bars.
He was sentenced by the judge, and they shuffled him off to prison, and all we could hear was the chains, and I thought, that's the end of the story. We're never going to hear what happened to Mike Williams.
Brian would receive 20 years for the aggravated kidnapping of his wife.
Little does Denise know, but 2 months earlier, prior to his kidnapping trial, Brian had agreed to tell authorities what really happened on the lake all those years ago.
He's looking for avenues of relief. You know, okay, I've got information. If I give this information, what can that get me? So we agreed to take his information. A deal was made that we would not pursue any charges dealing with Mike.
Brian did sit down with investigators and recorded interviews and told what he said was his side of the story.
2017, this is Tully Sparkman, investigator, State Attorney's Office. I'm here to take a proffer from Brian Winchester.
So I've known Denise my whole life, basically since preschool. We started having an affair October 13th, 1997.
As part of his plea agreement, Brian lays out how he and Denise became lovers while Brian was married to Kathy, and Denise was with Mike.
He goes into the affair they had a couple years before Mike went missing. It basically led to that infatuation and that drive for Denise. It was all about him and Denise.
Denise made it clear she would never get divorced, primarily because of appearances. She is ultra concerned about the way that she appears to the world.
To Denise, divorce was a nasty word, was a stain on her family, so divorce was not acceptable. So the talk then went to, all right, how would we do it?
She wanted a scenario where it wasn't a murder, but it was an accident.
Originally, there was talk about, well, go out on a boat with Kathy and with Mike and drown them. And Brian said, well, I don't want to kill my wife. I'll just divorce her.
And he told investigators that's when it was decided that it would just be him and Mike going out on the boat.
The plan was that he was going to be wearing waders, and the belief was somebody falls in the water with waders, you're going down. So we went out like we were going hunting. I got him to stand up, and I pushed him into the water.
Brian Winchester made it clear in his audio confession that not only was she a part of those conversations and the planning, but he said that she was the mastermind.
She said, no, this is the time.
Brian Winchester is sentenced to 20 years for kidnapping Denise. As part of a plea deal, Brian Winchester has not only confessed to the cold-blooded murder of his childhood friend Mike Williams, he has also implicated his now ex-wife, Denise.
Brian said he put Mike's body in his SUV. He drove around for hours not knowing what to do.
I wanted to get something to hide him with. And I got a tarp and a shovel.
Finally, he decided to go to Gardner Road, which is somewhat of a rural lake in Leon County, about 50 miles from where everyone had been searching. That's where he buried his best friend.
We went with Brian to the spot. He showed us, where he thought it was.
On October 18th, 2017, after 5 days of digging, the loving father who had vanished 17 years earlier is found in 6 feet of mud, still wearing his wedding ring. A DNA test confirms it's Mike Williams.
I get a telephone call from Nick, and he said, Mama, FGLE just called and said to be at your house in 30 minutes. They told us that my son Michael had been buried just 5 miles from my house. I don't know how to tell you how it felt, because all that time I'm looking for a child who's alive, and they tell me he's dead. He's been dead for 17 years. Part of me just died that day.
On May 8th, 2018, Denise is arrested while leaving work. She is charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Denise maintains that she is innocent. Denise's trial begins on December 10th, 2018. The prosecution's star witness is her own ex-husband, Brian.
Your Honor, this time today was called Brian Winchester.
So, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Brian and Mike had went duck hunting that morning. Mike Williams was wearing his waders, and Brian pushed him in, expecting him to drown.
He was in the water, and he was, struggling, but he was taking the waders and the jacket off. And he swam over to one of those stumps and held on to it. And he was panicking, and I was panicking. And I didn't know how to get out of that situation. And so I loaded my gun, and I made 1 or 2 circles around, and as I passed by, I shot him.
Where did you shoot him?
In the head.
Miss Cheryl was, of course, in the courtroom, and that's the first time she heard the intricate details of what happened and how it happened.
He was a good person. He was a friend to everybody. And now, at night when I go to sleep, the last thing I see is Michael clinging to a stump in the middle of a lake, screaming for help, and I wasn't there to help him. That's what I have to live with.
The jury deliberated for nearly 8 hours, but when they came back guilty on all charges. Denise, she was sentenced to life. I fully believe that without Miss Cheryl, the case would have probably been shut and closed off and done.
In November 2020, the First District Court of Appeals overturns Denise Williams' murder conviction and life sentence, ruling that the state had failed to prove that she helped Brian Winchester commit the crime.
I don't know that Denise has ever admitted to anything. She's very good at compartmentalizing stuff, that this is all Brian. I believe she'll stay that way till the end.
The separate charge of conspiracy to commit murder is upheld. Denise Williams remains in prison, serving out her 30-year sentence. The state of Florida is currently appealing the court's decision in an attempt to reinstate the first-degree murder conviction.
I have not had any contact with my granddaughter from the time she was 5 years old. Denise told me if I continued to try to get a criminal investigation, I would never be able to see my granddaughter again. And I told her I couldn't stop it. She's 22 years old. But I would love to have my granddaughter in my life. Oh, there's a million things I'd like her to know about her daddy. But the main thing I would like her to know is he loved her more than life itself. God told me you have to find him and bring him home. And I did. It took 17 years. And it nearly killed me. But I did.
The story of Wylie, Texas, in the year 1980, begins with a portrait of the quintessential American suburban dream. It was a place deliberately constructed to be a sanctuary, a quiet refuge situated comfortably away from the noise, the unpredictability, and the dangers of the sprawling urban centers. For the families who chose to settle there, Wylie was not just a geographic location, it was a promise of safety, stability, and a wholesome environment. The community was predominantly composed of middle and upper-class residents, individuals who took immense pride in their manicured lawns, their peaceful neighborhoods, and the predictable, comforting rhythms of their daily lives. In this serene enclave, the social and moral compass of the town was firmly planted within the walls of the local church. The church was the absolute center of community life, a gathering place where families bonded, where friendships were forged over potluck dinners and choir practices, and where the values of faith, morality, and fellowship were deeply ingrained in the fabric of everyday existence. The people of Wylie lived under the collective assumption that they were insulated from the darkness of the outside world. It was a place where doors could remain unlocked, where neighbors looked out for one another, and where the concept of brutal, senseless violence belonged exclusively to the evening news broadcasts reporting on distant cities. Yet, beneath this immaculate, carefully maintained veneer of suburban perfection, beneath the friendly waves and the Sunday sermons, lay the complex, often hidden, and deeply flawed realities of human nature. This contrast between outward perfection and internal turmoil is the very foundation of the tragedy that would soon shatter the town. At the heart of the story is a woman named Betty Gore. Betty represented everything that the community of Wylie valued and strived to protect. She was a dedicated elementary school teacher, a profession that inherently requires a deep well of patience, empathy, and a commitment to nurturing the future of the community. Beyond her classroom, she was a devoted mother and a wife, deeply focused on building a secure and loving home for her family. At the time of the events that would define her legacy, Betty was heavily pregnant, preparing to welcome her second child into the world. This should have been a period marked by joy, hopeful anticipation, and the gentle preparations for a growing family. Her home, a typical suburban house on a quiet street, was supposed to be her ultimate sanctuary, the safest place on earth for her and her children. The tragedy of Betty Gore is magnified exponentially by the stark, horrifying contrast between the life she was building and the unimaginable way in which it was violently taken from her. The violation of her sanctuary, the destruction of her peace, stands as a profound testament to the fragility of the safety we so often take for granted. Standing in direct, stark contrast to Betty was her close friend, Candy Montgomery. On the surface, Candy was the vibrant, energetic heartbeat of her social circle. She was a cheerful, highly active housewife, heavily involved in church activities and community events. She had a seemingly idyllic family life of her own, complete with a loving husband and 2 children. Candy was the type of person who easily navigated the social waters of suburban life, projecting an image of total contentment and fulfillment. She and Betty were bound by the intimate, shared experiences of motherhood, marriage, and neighborhood life. They trusted each other, spending time together and integrating their families into the shared routines of their peaceful community. However, behind the bright smiles and the energetic participation in church life, Candy harbored a deep, restless dissatisfaction. She found the predictable routines of her marriage and her suburban existence to be profoundly tedious. This hidden sense of boredom, this quiet desperation festering beneath a flawless exterior, drove her to make a calculated decision that would act as the catalyst for complete devastation. Seeking an escape from her perceived monotony, Candy actively pursued an extramarital affair, turning her attention toward Alan Gore, the husband of her close friend, Betty. The relationship that developed between Candy Montgomery and Alan Gore was not a fleeting moment of weakness, but a sustained, clandestine affair that spanned several months. It was a deliberate, continuous deception, a betrayal playing out in the shadows of their shared social spaces, happening quietly right under the noses of their friends, their church community, and most tragically, under the nose of Betty Gore. They navigated the logistics of infidelity while maintaining the outward appearances of devoted spouses and faithful congregants. Eventually, however, the weight of the deception and the shifting priorities of life intervened. Alan Gore made the decision to end the illicit relationship. As Betty's pregnancy progressed, Alan chose to step back from the affair, opting to recommit himself to his marriage and focus his attention on his expanding family. The termination of the affair should have been the definitive end of a dark, regrettable chapter. It should have allowed the secret to remain buried, preserving the fragile peace of their families. Instead, the emotional residue of that betrayal simply lay dormant, waiting for a spark to ignite a catastrophe that would forever alter the history of American jurisprudence. The morning of Friday, June 13, 1980, dawned with no indication of the horror it would bring. The day began with the most mundane, ordinary routines imaginable for a suburban summer day. Candy Montgomery drove the short distance to the Gore residence with a perfectly innocent stated purpose. She was simply stopping by to ask Betty for permission to have Betty's eldest daughter stay over at the Montgomery house to play and to pick up the young girl's swimsuit for a planned outing. It was an errand born of neighborhood convenience and maternal friendship. The absolute normalcy of this interaction is what makes the ensuing violence so difficult to process. There was no forced entry, no masked intruder, no warning signs of impending doom. Candy walked into the home of her friend as a welcomed guest, stepping into a familiar environment. Yet, within the walls of that peaceful suburban home, the careful construction of their lives began to violently unravel. As Candy prepared to leave the house, the unspoken tension finally breached the surface. Betty confronted Candy directly about the affair with her husband, Alan. Candy admitted to the past relationship, but emphatically insisted that it had long since ended, that it was a closed chapter with no bearing on the present. But the revelation of such a profound, intimate betrayal by someone trusted so deeply is not a matter that can be dismissed with a simple admission. What happened next inside the quiet confines of the utility room remains the subject of intense, horrifying debate. The emotional devastation of the confrontation rapidly escalated into a physical nightmare. According to the narrative that would later be presented, Betty, consumed by the shock and rage of the betrayal, retreated to a storage area and emerged wielding a heavy gardening axe, transforming a common tool of domestic life into an instrument of absolute terror. A desperate, violent struggle ensued between the two women. The forensic reality of the outcome, however, paints a picture of violence that completely eclipses any standard definition of a struggle. Betty Gore was subjected to an attack of incomprehensible brutality. The medical examiner would later document that she sustained a staggering total of 41 strikes from the heavy, sharp blade of the axe. The sheer savagery of the incident is highlighted by the grim detail that 28 of those devastating, bone-crushing blows were concentrated directly on her head and her face. Furthermore, the autopsy provided the chilling conclusion that Betty was still alive while this barrage of fatal strikes rained down upon her. The immense physical exertion required to swing a heavy axe 41 times, the intimate proximity to the victim, the visceral reality of the struggle in that confined space, indicates a profound, terrifying break from reality, a descent into sheer, unadulterated carnage. The immediate aftermath of the slaughter added a layer of chilling incomprehensibility to the crime. After delivering the final, fatal blow, Candy Montgomery did not succumb to immediate panic, nor did she flee in a state of chaotic shock. Instead, surrounded by the horrific evidence of the massacre, she calmly took the time to hastily wash herself in the victim's own home, scrubbing the blood from her skin. She disposed of her bloodied clothing and any immediate evidence of her presence, meticulously attempting to erase her connection to the scene. Then, with a composure that is deeply disturbing to contemplate, she simply walked out of the house. She left her friend's mutilated body lying on the floor of the utility room. Even more devastatingly, she left Betty's 1-year-old baby girl entirely alone in the house, abandoning the infant to spend the entire day crying in profound distress, isolated in a home that had just become a slaughterhouse. Candy returned to her own home, seamlessly slipping back into the role of the cheerful suburban mother. She took the children to the swimming pool, participating in the joyful, normal activities of a summer afternoon, projecting an aura of complete normalcy while harboring the secret of the bloodbath she had just committed. The tragic discovery was made later that evening. Alan Gore, who was away on a business trip, became increasingly frantic when he could not reach his wife by phone. The continuous, unanswered ringing echoed through his mind, transforming ordinary concern into a deep, paralyzing dread. Desperate, he reached out to neighbors, pleading with them to check on the house. It was these neighbors who finally entered the silent home, stepping into a nightmare that would permanently scar their lives. They discovered the violently destroyed body of Betty Gore in the laundry room, and they found the traumatized infant, still crying after hours of neglect. The discovery sent a shockwave of terror and absolute disbelief through the town of Wiley. The illusion of safety evaporated instantly, replaced by a gripping fear. The investigation, however, moved with rapid precision. The crime scene, despite Candy's attempts to clean it, yielded crucial forensic evidence. A bloody footprint and bloody fingerprints left behind in the chaotic aftermath were quickly and definitively matched to Candy Montgomery. Combined with Alan Gore's admission to the police regarding his prior extramarital affair with Candy, the authorities possessed a clear trail of evidence and a profound motive rooted in betrayal and jealousy. Candy was swiftly arrested, and the peaceful town suddenly found itself at the epicenter of a national media storm. The trial, which commenced in October of 1980, became a cultural touchstone, a deeply controversial spectacle that challenged the limits of legal defense and human psychology. The defense team presented a strategy that stunned the prosecution and the public alike. They did not deny that Candy had wielded the axe and caused the fatal wounds. Instead, they invoked the legal statutes of Texas, which permitted the use of lethal force in the act of self-defense. The core of their argument rested on the assertion that Betty, enraged by the affair, had initiated the attack with the axe, and that Candy had merely fought back in a desperate, primal struggle to save her own life. To explain the gross disproportion of the violence, the excessive 41 blows that seemed to completely negate the concept of simple self-defense, the defense introduced a highly controversial psychiatric theory. They brought a psychiatrist to the stand who had placed Candy under hypnosis. The resulting testimony claimed that during the life-or-death struggle, Betty had made a shushing sound, demanding that Candy be quiet. According to the defense, This specific sound acted as a profound psychological trigger, unlocking a deeply repressed trauma from Candy's own childhood. They argued that this trigger forced Candy into a severe dissociative state, a complete psychological fracture where she lost all conscious awareness and control, resulting in her striking the victim repeatedly in an unconscious, involuntary frenzy of self-preservation. The prosecution team, mirroring the sentiments of a horrified public, vehemently rejected this narrative. They argued passionately that 41 strikes with an axe could never be categorized as self-defense, regardless of psychological theories. They maintained that the sheer volume of the blows, coupled with Candy's cold, calculated actions to clean herself, hide the evidence, and casually go swimming afterward, demonstrated a clear, brutal presence of mind and a staggering capacity for violence. Yet, after hours of intense deliberation, the jury, consisting of 9 women and 3 men, rendered a verdict that continues to spark outrage and disbelief to this day. They accepted the defense's complex psychological narrative of self-defense and trauma, and they completely acquitted Candy Montgomery of the murder, pronouncing her not guilty. The announcement of the verdict triggered an immediate, visceral reaction from the community. A wave of intense anger swept through Wiley. Furious citizens gathered outside the courthouse walls, their voices merging into a unified chorus of outrage, chanting accusations at the woman who had just walked free. Despite the legal exoneration, the court of public opinion had rendered its own unyielding judgment. In the wake of the trial, facing the unbearable weight of the community's wrath, Candy Montgomery changed her name, packed her belongings, and fled the state of Texas, moving to Georgia to reinvent herself as a family mental health counselor. The blood-stained events of that June morning left an indelible, haunting mark on the history of Wiley, creating a legacy of unanswered questions and profound injustice that continues to fascinate and horrify the world, serving as the grim inspiration for countless books and television adaptations that still seek to unravel the dark truth behind the 41 blows. To understand the tragedy that struck the small town of Wiley, Texas, in 1980, it is absolutely essential to first immerse oneself in the unique atmosphere of that time and place, and above all, to paint an intimate and nuanced portrait of its tragic victim. Wiley was not an anonymous metropolis where crime blends into the urban background noise. It was the perfect embodiment of the suburban American dream, a peaceful enclave at a reassuring distance from the stifling bustle of Dallas. In this community, the streets were lined with meticulously trimmed trees, the immaculate green lawns were tended with almost religious fervor, and the stately homes represented the triumph of the thriving middle class. The residents of Wiley shared a common and reassuring vision of life, deeply rooted in hard work, traditional family values, and unwavering faith. It was a place people settled in precisely to escape the violence and uncertainty of the outside world, a sanctuary where doors didn't always need to be locked at night and where neighbors all knew each other by their first names. The air was heavy with the Texas summer heat, but also with a tranquility everyone believed to be indestructible. At the absolute center of this social microcosm was the church, the true beating heart and moral compass of the community. The area's United Methodist Church wasn't just a place of solemn Sunday worship. It was the fundamental axis around which all meaningful social interactions revolved. It was in its parish halls that lasting friendships were forged, lavish charity dinners were held, choir rehearsals took place, and Bible study groups met. For families residing in Wiley, active membership in this congregation was the ultimate seal of unquestionable respectability. In such an environment, the appearance of perfection was not merely a superficial desire. It was demanded by an invisible, crushing, and pervasive social pressure. Every family unit was expected to relentlessly project the image of flawless domestic bliss. It was precisely within this rigid, normative, and demanding framework that Betty Gore desperately tried to build her life, find her rightful place, and give profound meaning to her existence, constantly navigating between her own inner insecurities and the monumental expectations of those around her. Betty Gore, born Betty Pomeroy, was a young woman whose deep and authentic nature stood in stark contrast to the often artificial and forced exuberance that characterized the vibrant social circles of the suburbs. She was absolutely not one to seek the limelight or loudly dominate conversations at church gatherings. On the contrary, Betty possessed an infinitely quiet gentleness, a natural and cautious reserve that could sometimes, to those who didn't know her well, be mistaken for aloofness, excessive shyness, or even coldness. Physically, she exuded a charming and reassuring simplicity, wearing a sincere smile, though often tinged with a touch of melancholy. Her true element, the place where she truly blossomed, where she regained control, and where her chronic self-doubts magically vanished, wasn't the stuffy social gatherings of Wiley, but rather the protective and familiar walls of her classroom. By choosing the career of primary school teacher, Betty had found much more than a profession. She had embraced a true vocation that perfectly matched her visceral need to care for others, to guide, and to transmit fundamental moral and educational values. Within the confines of her classroom, Betty transformed into an exceptionally benevolent authority figure. She cherished each of her students with a steadfast devotion that earned the unanimous admiration of her colleagues. For her, teaching was never a mere daily chore, it was a total emotional commitment. She intuitively and profoundly understood the small sorrows and great joys of the young children entrusted to her care. She tirelessly strove to create for them an incredibly safe, structured, and stimulating learning environment, perhaps seeking to replicate the perfection of the ideal home she so ardently tried to establish in her own. Those who knew her in the school hallways fondly remember an infinitely patient, extremely meticulous, sometimes even slightly rigid educator in her absolute desire to do things right, but always driven by an unconditional love for pedagogy and childhood. This exemplary professional devotion was, in reality, the exact mirror of her dearest and deepest desire in her private life, to build a perfect, loving, united, and indestructible family, a veritable impenetrable fortress against all the frightening uncertainties of the outside world. It was precisely this fundamental need for stability, security, and rootedness that had naturally and gently drawn her to Alan Gore during their years at university. Alan was not at all the type of young man to ignite tumultuous, unstable, or devastating romantic passions. He was naturally calm, intensely pragmatic, firmly grounded in the mathematical, predictable, and logical reality of his future career as an engineer. For Betty, who constantly carried within her a certain existential anxiety and a fear of the unknown, Alan represented an unshakable rock, a formal promise of financial and emotional security, and the guarantee of a life free from unpleasant surprises. Their marriage hadn't blossomed from a dazzling, blinding romance, but rather from a tender, growing affection, and above all, a perfectly shared and pragmatic vision of the future. They both ardently desired the same thing, a beautiful suburban house with a garden, children running in the grass, social respectability, and absolute tranquility. However, over the long years, the tranquility they had so desperately sought and finally achieved had insidiously and slowly transformed into a kind of silent, oppressive monotony. The Gores' married life, though outwardly impeccable and admirable from the outside, was beginning to suffer terribly from a glaring lack of intimate communication, passion, and genuine emotional connection. Alan, completely absorbed by his increasing responsibilities and demanding job at Rockwell International, spent very long hours away from the family home. His eminently analytical and rational mind sometimes made him terribly distant, almost incapable of perceiving or adequately responding to his wife's complex, fluctuating, and often unspoken emotional needs. Betty, for her part, found herself far too often alone, wandering through the large, now eerily silent house, confronting her own dark thoughts and a dull anguish she struggled immensely to voice. The long-awaited birth of their first daughter, Elisa, had undeniably brought immense joy and new light to their home, but it had also dramatically exacerbated Betty's latent fears. Motherhood, with all its crushing responsibilities, constant self-doubt, and physical demands, had paradoxically isolated her even further. She felt monumental social and personal pressure to be the absolutely perfect mother, according to the often unattainable and hypocritical standards imposed by the bourgeois society of the time. The endless sleepless nights, the irrational and constant worries about the slightest cough from her child, all of this accumulated day after day in the stifling silence of the house, digging an invisible but dizzying chasm between her and her husband who, despite his occasional physical presence, seemed increasingly inaccessible on an emotional level. The loneliness Betty felt was by no means physical, for she was constantly surrounded by the vibrant church community, by a circle of other mothers and devoted wives. It was an infinitely more cruel loneliness, a psychological loneliness, a profound and permanent sense of disconnect from her immediate surroundings. Around her, the other women, like those who formed the core of her social circle, seemed to juggle with disconcerting ease and grace the rigorous upbringing of children, the meticulous maintenance of immaculate homes, the preparation of elaborate meals, and the extremely active and enthusiastic participation in numerous parish works. These women displayed radiant and unwavering smiles in all circumstances, organized perfect Sunday gatherings, and seemed miraculously immune to physical fatigue, self-doubt, or postpartum depression. Betty, with her far more introspective temperament, her raw sensitivity, and the chronic self-doubt that gnawed at her from within, felt shamefully inadequate compared to these paragons of perfection. She struggled daily with bouts of persistent melancholy, desperately trying to conceal them beneath a thick facade of smiling normality. She longed to fit in completely, to be exactly like those energetic, radiant, and unwaveringly confident women, but the monumental effort this required often left her exhausted and drained of her vital energy. The year 1980 marked an absolutely decisive, delicate, and ultimately tragic turning point in Betty's already complex life. She discovered, with some apprehension, that she was pregnant with her second child. This news, which, according to suburban norms, should have been a source of absolute joy and pure happiness, brought with it a new wave of barely controllable anxiety. Her very first pregnancy had been fraught with physical difficulties, and the daunting thought of having to go through that long physiological ordeal again, while simultaneously caring for a young, energetic child, terrified her. As the long months dragged on and Betty's belly grew rounder, her daily physical discomfort increased exponentially, further exacerbating her already precarious emotional fragility. That year, Texas was experiencing a particularly early, violent, and literally suffocating start to summer. The oppressive, heavy, and humid heat that hung relentlessly over the rooftops of Wiley seemed to ominously reflect the internal psychological suffocation Betty felt every day. She spent more and more time secluded at home, with the shutters half closed, desperately seeking the artificial and noisy comfort of air conditioning, involuntarily and tragically isolating herself from the rest of the world and her support network. During this interminable time, the abysmal emotional distance between her and Alan seemed to have definitively solidified. Alan was fleeing, perhaps unconsciously but surely, the heavy, tense, and perpetually anxious atmosphere of his family home. He traveled more and more frequently for his time-consuming job, leaving poor Betty to cope alone and helplessly with the painful throes of her advanced pregnancy and the constant needs of their little girl. Betty felt cruelly abandoned, heartbreakingly vulnerable, and increasingly dependent on her husband on a purely emotional level. This growing emotional dependence, unfortunately, only deepened the unbearable sense of emptiness when he didn't respond to her silent cries for help. She clung with the energy of despair to the sacred idea of her marriage, stubbornly refusing to see the gaping cracks that threatened to bring down the very foundations of her meticulously constructed world. For her, the concept of family was untouchable. It was the central, unique, and indispensable pillar of her identity as a woman. The very idea, the mere possibility, that this fundamental pillar could collapse or be shaken was absolutely and categorically intolerable to her. In her tragic innocence, she was completely unaware that the foundations of her entire life were already being profoundly eroded from within, not by her own consuming insecurities, but by an intimate, calculated, and devastating betrayal unfolding silently behind her back, coldly orchestrated by the very people in whom she had placed her absolute trust. It is profoundly tragic and heartbreaking to realize how fundamentally good Betty Gore was, an exceptionally dedicated educator committed to the development of her students and a self-sacrificingly loving mother whose greatest weaknesses were, in reality, nothing more than terribly ordinary and understandable human anxieties. She asked absolutely nothing more of the universe than a peaceful, drama-free life, a present and attentive husband, and the absolute certainty that her modest home was a safe haven from life's storms. Her flaws, if one can even call them that in retrospect, lay solely in her immense difficulty in verbally expressing her pent-up frustrations, in her unfortunate tendency to internalize all her sorrows to the point of implosion, and in her sometimes suffocating need for constant reassurance. She represented, in the purest form, the hidden, painful, melancholic, and often cowardly ignored side of the dazzling American suburban dream, that very place where the relentless pressure of artificial perfection slowly and gently crushes the most sensitive and vulnerable souls. As the fateful month of June approached with its oppressive heat, Betty prepared herself mentally and physically, with the courage of a mother, for the imminent arrival of her new baby. She carefully folded tiny clothes, arranged the nursery, trying with all her might to focus on that bright future to banish the lingering shadows that clouded her anxious present. Little did she know that her cherished sanctuary, this family home she was trying so desperately to transform into an impenetrable protective cocoon, would very soon become the bloody stage for one of the most unimaginable, barbaric, and shocking acts of violence in criminal history. She couldn't have suspected for a moment that the deadly threat wouldn't come from a menacing stranger lurking in the terrifying darkness of night, but would simply walk through the front door in broad daylight, disguised as the familiar, smiling, and seemingly harmless friend. Betty Gore's portrait is definitively that of a profoundly ordinary woman, painfully imprisoned by her own paralyzing fears and the suffocating conventions of her time. It's the story of a woman who fought silently and bravely each day to keep afloat the comforting illusion of her marital bliss, heartbreakingly unaware that the fragile fabric of her life was about to be brutally, savagely, and irrevocably torn to shreds, leaving behind a deafening silence in the once peaceful streets of Wiley. The morning of Friday, June 13th, 1980, dawned over the town of Wiley with the familiar promise of another Texas summer day, a sweltering day where the heat was already beginning to make the air shimmer above the pristine asphalt of the quiet suburban streets, marking the start of what should have been an utterly ordinary weekend for this peaceful community, where every moment seemed meticulously planned and reassuring. Candy Montgomery, brimming with the boundless energy and self-assurance that so defined her, got behind the wheel of her car to drive the short distance between her own house and the Gore residence, embarking on a journey whose utter banality made the events that were about to unfold all the more inconceivable and terrifying. The stated purpose of this early morning visit was childlike in its simplicity and perfectly in keeping with the fabric of neighborly relations in this bourgeois enclave, to ask Betty Gore for permission to look after her eldest daughter for the day and to retrieve the child's swimsuit in anticipation of a recreational outing to the local pool, a gesture that exuded innocence and camaraderie between devoted mothers. When she knocked on the Gore's door, nothing foreshadowed the impending horror. The house's facade displayed the same quiet tranquility that defined the entire neighborhood, carefully concealing the emotional rifts and unbearable tensions that secretly simmered within its walls. Betty Gore, bearing the physical and psychological weight of her advanced pregnancy, opened the door to the woman she still considered a close friend, letting Candy into her intimate sanctuary, the home she desperately tried to protect from the uncertainties of the outside world, completely unaware that the real threat didn't come from the unknown but took on the familiar, smiling features of someone she had placed her trust in. The first moments of this encounter most likely unfolded beneath the usual veneer of suburban politeness, with exchanges of small talk about the children, the summer heat, and weekend plans, temporarily masking the disaster brewing beneath the surface. However, as the visit drew to a close and Candy prepared to leave and return to her seemingly perfect life, the heavy, conditioned atmosphere of the house suddenly shifted, crackling with a deadly, electric tension as the silence was broken by an inevitable question, one Betty had undoubtedly been carrying with her for some time, gnawing at her anxious mind and fueling her worst nightmares. Betty, with the courage born of despair of those who feel their world crumbling, confronted Candy directly and bluntly about her suspicions of an intimate, illicit relationship between her guest and her own husband, Alan Gore, an accusation that instantly shattered the illusion of their friendship and exposed the most intimate and devastating betrayal imaginable. Cornered by this sudden confrontation in the privacy of her victim's home, Candy could no longer deny the obvious and finally admitted to the existence of this past extramarital affair, while hastening to assert with disconcerting coldness that this carnal and emotional relationship with Alan had definitively ended long ago, as if this simple temporal detail could erase the unspeakable pain, the profound humiliation, and the total destruction of trust that this revelation inflicted on Betty. For Betty Gore, a woman whose entire identity rested on the sanctity of her marriage and the security of her home, hearing this confession from her friend's own lips must have provoked an absolute psychological collapse, a terrifying feeling of vertigo where everything she believed to be true, everything she cherished and protected, was revealed to be nothing but a monstrous illusion woven from lies and deceit at the very heart of her own religious community. The pain of this betrayal, exacerbated by her physical vulnerability due to pregnancy and her own chronic insecurities, triggered a reaction of tragic intensity, transforming the verbal confrontation into a fatal point of no return in the small laundry room of the house, a cramped and functional domestic space that would soon become the bloody scene of a massacre of unimaginable brutality. According to the version of events later recounted by the sole survivor of this deadly ordeal, Betty, overwhelmed by a wave of shock, grief, and profound rage at the destruction of her family life, went to an adjoining storage area and emerged armed with a garden axe, a heavy, blunt, and sharp tool, thus introducing an immediate lethal threat into this domestic altercation and plunging the situation into a dimension of pure and uncontrollable violence. What happened next in that confined space, between the hum of appliances and the narrow walls of the laundry room, was a desperate struggle for survival, a physical confrontation of unimaginable savagery where reason completely gave way to the most primal instinct, culminating in an explosion of lethal violence of terrifying disproportion that still chills the blood decades later. The cold, clinical, and implacable conclusions of the forensic pathologists who meticulously examined the crime scene and the victim's tortured body tell a story far more macabre and chilling than a simple fight for self-defense. They describe a murderous rampage of unspeakable cruelty, an unleashing of destructive force that literally annihilated the victim. The autopsy report, meticulously documenting each wound with terrifying mathematical precision, revealed that Betty Gore was struck 41 times by the heavy, sharp blade of the axe, an astronomical number of blows that testifies to a bloodthirsty frenzy far exceeding the bounds of a defensive reaction, illustrating instead a will to total and absolute annihilation of the other. Even more unbearable is the horrifying discovery that of these 41 devastating axe blows, 28 were directed with deadly accuracy and terrifying ferocity directly at the victim's head and face, crushing bones, destroying flesh, and literally obliterating the features of this devoted mother in a bloody mess of violence. The true horror of this tragedy, the detail that haunts the nights of all who examine this case, lies in the medical conclusion stating that Betty Gore was still very much alive and conscious during the majority of the massacre, enduring an agony of unimaginable intensity, feeling every shattering impact, every tearing of her body, bathed in her own blood on the cold linoleum of her laundry room as life violently ejected her, torn from her by the hands of the woman she had sheltered under her roof. The extreme violence of the act, the considerable physical strength required to lift and bring down such a heavy weapon 41 times in such a confined space, underscores the state of absolute frenzy in which the assailant found herself. transforming an ordinary Friday morning into a waking nightmare where the very walls of the house were spattered with the blood of an innocent woman whose only fault was seeking the truth about the destruction of her marriage. However, the climax of horror in the Candy Montgomery case doesn't end with the final, fatal blow of the axe. It resides just as poignantly and disturbingly in the murderer's cold, methodical, and profoundly inhuman reaction in the minutes and hours immediately following this unspeakable carnage. Surrounded by the macabre evidence of her brutality, wading through the pool of blood that widened around the mutilated corpse of her former friend, Candy Montgomery showed no sign of hysterical panic, made no attempt to call for help in a sudden surge of remorse, and did not flee the scene screaming in despair. Instead, with a cold-bloodedness that defies all logic and moral explanation, she took the chilling time to go to her victim's own bathroom and methodically wash herself, using water from the Gore's home to clean away the splashes of warm blood that stained her skin, painstakingly erasing the physical traces of her barbaric act while likely contemplating her reflection in the mirror of the woman she had just slaughtered. After disposing of the most incriminating evidence, arranging her clothes to conceal any abnormalities, and regaining a deceptive appearance of normalcy, she walked toward the exit, leaving behind a scene of domestic apocalypse, abandoning Betty's lifeless, unrecognizable, and bloodied body on the cold laundry room floor. But the cruelest, most heartbreaking, and most unforgivable detail of her methodical escape remains the deliberate and callous abandonment of Betty's 1-year-old baby, little Bethany, who was in the house, completely isolated, vulnerable, and defenseless amidst this silent charnel house. Candy Montgomery crossed the threshold, carefully closed the house on her terrible secret, imprisoning the infant with her mother's mutilated corpse, and condemned her to spend the entirety of that long summer day crying in terror, hunger, and despair in her crib, her cries of distress echoing in vain through the deserted corridors of this house-turned tomb. Stepping out into the dazzling, oppressive heat of the Texas sun, Candy blended back into the perfect suburban setting, resuming her day with a nauseating normality, returning to her own house, gathering the children as agreed, and taking them to spend a joyful, carefree afternoon at the local pool, laughing and chatting with other members of the community, acting with psychopathic indifference while just a few blocks away, Betty Gore's blood began to coagulate, and the incessant crying of an abandoned baby was the one and only requiem for a life savagely cut short. The stark, violent, and unbearable contrast between the bright banality of that summer afternoon spent by the clear waters of the pool and the unfathomable darkness of the cruelty that had just been unleashed in the Gore's laundry room represents the very heart of this unfathomable mystery, demonstrating the terrifying capacity of human beings to compartmentalize absolute horror and to wear the perfect mask of social normality just after perpetrating the most monstrous act, leaving the town of Wiley to drift gently into a peaceful summer evening, totally unaware of the monster that was now hiding in broad daylight among its inhabitants and of the indescribable tragedy that was waiting to be discovered in the silent gloom of the Gore's residence. The sun on that Friday, June 13th, 1980, had finally set, giving way to a heavy, stifling evening over the small town of Wiley, Texas. An unusually oppressive atmosphere seemed to reflect the silent anxiety that was beginning to grip some homes, particularly that of the Gore family, where Betty's prolonged absence and stubborn silence were starting to seriously gnaw at Alan Gore's mind. Currently away on business, Alan had repeatedly tried to reach his wife by phone, desperately ringing the telephone lines in a house devoid of any answer, a completely abnormal situation that contrasted sharply with the well-ordered routines of his household. As the hours passed and the phone continued to ring unanswered, with no familiar voice to soothe his anxieties, a growing wave of dread, cold panic, and ominous forebodings gripped him, transforming the husband's eagerness into an absolute and unbearable urgency. Unable to endure this agonizing uncertainty any longer, and sensing deep within that some unspeakable misfortune had befallen his home, Alan made the desperate decision to contact his neighbors, pleading with them over the phone to come to his residence immediately to check on his well-being and ensure that Betty and their baby were not suffering from a sudden medical problem or a household accident. And so, responding to Alan's panicked call, the neighbors made their way to the Gore house, completely unaware that by crossing that seemingly familiar and peaceful threshold, they were about to enter a waking nightmare, a scene of bloody desolation that would forever shatter the tranquility of their community and indelibly mark the fate of all involved. As they approached the house, nothing unusual was apparent from the outside. The shutters were half closed to ward off the oppressive heat of the Texas summer, and the silence surrounding the building initially seemed to be that of an ordinary suburban evening. However, upon entering the house through an unlocked or ajar door, the neighbors were immediately struck by a heavy atmosphere, thick with a nauseating metallic odor, and by the incessant, hoarse, heart-rending cries of little Bethany, a 1-year-old baby left alone in her room, screaming from hunger, fear, and exhaustion for hours. Following the child's piercing cries and the morbid call of their intuition, the neighbors ventured into the dimly lit hallways to discover, in the house's cramped laundry room, a scene of absolute horror that would haunt their nights for the rest of their days. The lifeless and horribly mutilated body of Betty Gore lay amidst a pool of blood that had congealed on the cold linoleum, a vision of pure, unadulterated carnage that revealed the unspeakable violence of the attack, instantly transforming the beloved home into a crime scene of immeasurable savagery. The terrifying discovery was immediately reported to local authorities, triggering the rapid arrival of wily police and homicide detectives, turning the once quiet residential neighborhood into a veritable fortress surrounded by the flashing lights of patrol cars and yellow tape barring public access. Upon entering the gruesome laundry room, investigators quickly realized they were dealing with a crime of passion or an act of extreme personal violence, as the nature of the victim's injuries left no doubt as to the assailant's rage and ferocity. Yet, despite the brutality of the attack and the blood splattered across the walls and floor, the crime scene also presented disturbing clues that pointed to a desperate but clumsy attempt at cleanup, suggesting that the perpetrator had taken the time to wash and conceal some evidence before fleeing the scene in haste. The forensic technicians, working with surgical precision under the harsh glare of portable spotlights, quickly uncovered bloody footprints and partial fingerprints left on the surfaces of the house, crucial physical evidence that would provide the essential thread to track down the killer and unravel the mystery of this barbaric execution. By cross-referencing this physical evidence with initial statements gathered from neighbors and family, Candy Montgomery's name quickly rose to the forefront of the investigators' concerns, especially since Alan Gore, devastated by the news of his wife's tragic death, immediately displayed brutal honesty by revealing to the police his past extramarital affair with Candy, thus shattering the community's best-kept secret and providing the authorities with a powerful and obvious motive based on jealousy, betrayal, and emotional settling of scores. The pieces of the macabre puzzle began to fall into place with an implacable logic in the minds of the investigators, linking Candy's seemingly innocent morning visit for a swimsuit to the discovery of the body riddled with axe wounds, transforming the friendly, active housewife into the prime suspect in a murder that had shaken the moral foundations of the entire town of Wiley. Just days after the gruesome discovery, the police arrested Candy Montgomery, an event that sent shockwaves through the community, stunning churchgoers, neighbors, and everyone who had known her and believed her to be the very embodiment of the perfect mother and wife. Candy's first-degree murder charge immediately propelled the small Texas town into the national media spotlight, attracting hordes of journalists, reporters, and onlookers from across the country to witness the unfolding of this extraordinary suburban drama that seemed straight out of a crime novel. The relentless legal process that began led, in October of that same year, 1980, to the opening of a sensational trial that would captivate the attention of all of America and transform into a veritable legal and psychological battleground. In the packed and stifling courtroom, under the glare of cameras and the inquisitive gaze of the public, Candy Montgomery's defense team adopted a bold, unexpected, and highly controversial strategy that would completely overturn traditional criminal law and defy the rational logic of the jury. Rather than deny Candy's physical involvement in the murder, which would have been impossible given the overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence and fingerprints found at the scene, the formidable team of lawyers led by Don Crowder chose to go all in, pleading self-defense and relying on Texas law that permitted the use of lethal force to protect one's own life in the event of an imminent fatal attack. According to the dramatic and detailed version presented by the defense, Candy had gone to Betty's house that morning without any hostile intent, but the brutal confrontation initiated by Betty regarding Candy's affair with Alan had completely spiraled out of control when Betty, consumed by rage and grief, grabbed a heavy garden axe in an attempt to kill Candy. This forced Candy into a desperate, ferocious, and purely instinctive struggle to wrest the weapon from her attacker and save her own life from certain death. To justify the appalling disproportion between this alleged self-defense and the barbaric reality of the 41 axe blows inflicted upon the victim, the defense introduced an audacious psychiatric argument, calling upon mental health experts and subjecting Candy to hypnotherapy sessions to explore the darkest recesses of her subconscious and attempt to explain what had truly transpired behind closed doors in the laundry room. The psychiatrists called to the stand by the defense presented a fascinating and highly speculative theory, claiming that during the fierce struggle for the axe, Betty uttered a specific word or made a precise gesture, perhaps a whispered command to be quiet or a warning gesture, that acted as a destructive psychological trigger, suddenly awakening a trauma deeply buried in Candy's heavy, silent childhood past. According to this complex psychological explanation, this particular signal would have tipped Candy into an acute dissociative state, a kind of hypnotic, unconscious trance where she lost all contact with reality, all control over her actions, and all awareness of her own strength, transforming into a frenzied automaton acting out of pure, regressive panic and repeatedly striking the victim in a deluge of blind unconsciousness until the perceived threat was completely neutralized. Faced with this astonishing line of defense, the prosecution reacted with undisguised indignation, calling this psychiatric theory a pure fabrication, concocted to absolve a calculating and cold-blooded murderer who had methodically planned or coldly executed a crime of unspeakable cruelty. The prosecutors hammered home to the incredulous jury that 41 blows with an axe, 28 of which struck a pregnant woman in the face and head, could in no way be considered self-defense, emphasizing the moral aberration of such a conclusion and recalling Candy's chilling demeanor after the murder, when she calmly washed herself, threw away her clothes, and went to take some children to the swimming pool as if nothing had happened. The prosecutor's arguments echoed the muted and palpable anger of a public opinion completely horrified by the turn of events in the trial, with the population of Wiley and the surrounding area watching, scandalized, as an attempt was made to transform a bloodthirsty butcher into a poor victim of a transient dissociative disorder brought on by a mere whisper. Despite the overwhelming evidence of the unprecedented violence, despite the prosecutor's resounding rejection of this theory and the widespread condemnation from the community, the jury of 9 women and 3 men retired to deliberate, locking themselves away for hours to weigh the pros and cons of this complex case that intertwined human impulses, suburban adultery, and modern psychiatry. When the final verdict was delivered, acquitting Candy Montgomery of all murder charges and pronouncing her complete acquittal on the grounds of self-defense, an emotional and legal earthquake struck, plunging the courtroom into stunned silence before unleashing a wave of indignation and anger that would resonate far beyond the borders of Texas. The jury's decision to accept the self-defense and dissociative state thesis had established the most controversial legal victory in the modern history of American justice, leaving behind a bitter taste of blatant injustice for Betty Gore's loved ones and forever transforming Wiley's tragedy into an unforgettable psychological and criminal mystery. The resounding verdict delivered at the end of October 1980 acted like an explosion of unprecedented violence within the small community of Wiley and far beyond, triggering a media and emotional earthquake that would forever alter the American public's perception of justice. When the jury foreman acquitted Candy Montgomery of the brutal murder of Betty Gore on the grounds of self-defense and transient dissociative disorder, the general astonishment immediately gave way to a wave of raw, palpable, and visceral anger that erupted as loudly as possible outside the courthouse. Hundreds of Wiley residents, distraught neighbors, and ordinary citizens, deeply shocked by what they considered a monstrous travesty of justice, had gathered outside the courthouse doors, waving protest signs and shouting their outrage with relentless fervor. Cries of murderer and unpunished assassin erupted from all sides in the heavy, dusty Texas air, aimed directly at the woman who had just regained her freedom and was leaving the scene under a tight police escort, shielding her face from the lenses of cameras and the public outcry that threatened to erupt at any moment. For Betty Gore's family, especially for her parents and her husband Alan, this verdict of not guilty represented a second death, a complete denial of the unspeakable suffering endured by the victim, transforming their grief into a perpetual nightmare where the blatant injustice of a justice system manipulated by outlandish psychiatric theories seemed to triumph over the most basic truth. National newspaper columnists, legal commentators, and criminology experts across the country seized upon the case, dissecting every minute of the trial, every defense argument, and every flaw in the prosecution's case, questioning with astonishment how a jury could have accepted the notion that striking a pregnant woman 41 times with an axe, 28 of them in the face, was a legitimate defensive reaction and a mere psychological blackout triggered by a kind word or a whisper. The gaping chasm between the court's legal decision and the moral conscience of American society only widened with each passing week, transforming Candy Montgomery's name into a universal symbol of controversy, psychological manipulation, and the fear that even the most barbaric violence might escape legal repercussions thanks to the eloquence of brilliant and audacious lawyers. In the midst of this media storm and growing public hostility, daily life in Wiley had become simply unbearable for Candy and her family. The once welcoming and familiar suburban streets had transformed into hostile territory where every glance from a neighbor, every whisper in the supermarket aisles, and every menacing shadow reminded them that they were now outcasts in their own community. Aware that rebuilding a normal life was impossible under the crushing weight of collective hatred and the indelible stigma of this bloody affair, the Montgomery family made the radical decision to pack up, sell their house, and flee Texas for good, seeking anonymity and a fresh start elsewhere in the country. Candy, changing her name to try and erase the traces of her scandalous past and make people forget the face of the woman she had disfigured with an axe, settled in the state of Georgia, trying her best to blend into the landscape of a new community that knew nothing of her macabre history. In this new life built on the ruins of an unspeakable secret, she embarked on a paradoxical and disturbing career change, choosing to work in the field of mental health, becoming a marriage and family counselor, a profession where she claimed to help couples in distress and guide tormented souls through emotional storms, even as she carried within her the terrifying weight of a deadly rampage she herself had unleashed in a wily laundromat. This striking contradiction between her professed commitment to easing human conflict and her own bloody past has continued to fascinate and terrify investigative journalists who, over the years, have tried to track her down and unravel the psychological mystery of this ordinary woman who became a killing machine before reverting to being a model citizen. Meanwhile, in Wiley, the wound left by Betty Gore's horrific death has never fully healed, the community continuing to mourn a gentle and loving woman whose life was so brutally cut short by a friend in whom she had placed all her trust and whose memory remains tainted by the revolting absurdity of a verdict that refused to call the crime what it truly was. Betty's children, too young to grasp the full extent of the tragedy at the time, grew up far from their hometown, cared for by their maternal grandparents who tried to heal their wounds and offer them a semblance of childhood despite the immense void left by their mother's tragic and violent absence. Alan Gore, for his part, remarried shortly after the trial ended, seeking to turn the page on such a painful chapter of his life, but forever carrying the invisible burden of guilt for having caused, through his romantic choices and adulterous affair, the fatal collision between two women that led to the irreparable. Time, although it has calmed the loudest manifestations of popular anger, has never managed to erase the cultural impact of this case, which quickly entered the dark legend of great American news stories, inspiring generations of writers, journalists, and television scriptwriters who saw in Wiley's tragedy the ideal ground for exploring the hypocrisies of suburban life, the ravages of stifled adultery, and the troubling limits of modern psychiatry in the face of homicidal violence. True crime books written on the subject have sold millions of copies, elevating the Candy Montgomery case to the status of an essential case study in law and criminology departments, where students still debate the relevance of the defense by dissociative state and the justice of a verdict that continues to divide minds between moral outrage and fascination with the darkest corners of the human psyche. Later, in the era of streaming and blockbuster television series devoted to the most significant real-life crimes in history, the case experienced a dramatic resurgence through several high-profile film and television adaptations, such as the classic 1990s TV movie and later the acclaimed series titled Candy and Love and Death, which brought the faces of Candy, Betty, and Alan back into the international spotlight, allowing a new audience to discover the suffocating complexity of this Texas drama. These fictional works, while dramatizing events for the sake of the narrative, have brought back to light the underlying human tragedy, giving Betty Gore a voice and reminding us through millions of screens around the world that behind the gleaming, perfect veneer of manicured suburban American lawns sometimes lie abysses of despair, jealousy, and destructive rage capable of transforming a peaceful June morning into a bloody massacre whose echoes still resonate, 40 years later, as a chilling warning about the fragility of appearances and the unfathomable darkness that lies dormant in the heart of every human being. As the media spotlight slowly faded, as the television cameras left the small town of Wiley, and as the criminal history books froze this tragedy into the yellowed pages of the most extraordinary news stories of modern America, the true legacy of that Friday, June 13th, 1980, lies in the fundamental questions it leaves behind, persistent inquiries into human nature, the limits of our justice system, and the frightening fragility of appearances that form the bedrock of our life in society. The drama that unfolded in the cramped laundry room of the Gore house is not simply a bloody news item involving the adultery of two respectable members of a religious community, nor even the brilliant but controversial legal exercise of a defense by the dissociative state. It stands above all as a terrifying exploration of the silent abysses that human beings can dig beneath their own feet when cornered by fear, jealousy, frustration, and the visceral need to preserve at all costs a facade of perfection that reality is determined to destroy. Wiley, with its tree-lined streets, immaculate lawns, and churches full of worshippers on Sunday mornings, represented the pinnacle of security for its residents, an impenetrable sanctuary where the horrors of the outside world were supposed to stop at the city limits. But the unprecedented violence that erupted that day proved in the most brutal way possible that the most fearsome monster is never the one that emerges from the unknown in the darkness of night, but rather the one who shares our daily lives, who smiles beside us at neighborhood barbecues, and who crosses our threshold in the reassuring guise of a longtime friend. The tragedy of Betty Gore is that of a profoundly human woman, imprisoned by her own anxieties and the social pressures of an era that demanded women be irreproachable wives, perfect mothers, and tireless homemakers, all while stifling their doubts and distress beneath a veneer of perpetual smiles and complicit silence. Her life, cut short in its prime by 41 blows of an axe of immeasurable savagery, has become the tragic symbol of absolute vulnerability in the face of intimate betrayal and blind violence, a poignant reminder that behind the closed doors of bourgeois appearances, psychological dramas of a destructive intensity sometimes unfold, dramas that no one suspects. On the other side of this macabre equation, the figure of Candy Montgomery continues to haunt the collective imagination, not only because of the disturbing contrast between her seemingly sunny, energetic, and engaging nature and the monstrous brutality of the acts she committed, but also because of the fascination exerted by her acquittal. A verdict that transformed a killer into a free woman thanks to the audacity of a psychiatric theory that convinced a jury that panic and a simple whisper could short-circuit human consciousness to the point of legitimizing 41 blade impacts. This legal outcome, perceived by the vast majority of the public and the victim's family as a monumental and outrageous injustice, raises the persistent question of individual responsibility and the potential manipulation of psychiatric science to ensure impunity. transforming courts into arenas where factual truth can sometimes be eclipsed by sophisticated narratives about childhood trauma and transient dissociative states. The impact of this case on the small community of Wiley has been profound and lasting, acting as a painful catalyst as residents have had to learn to live with the weight of a nationally known secret, redefining their neighborly relations through the lens of mistrust and the realization that no one truly knows what lies hidden in the mind of their neighbor. For Betty's children, who grew up bearing the unspeakable burden of losing their mother in such barbaric circumstances and witnessing her murder go unpunished by the law, the path to resilience must have been paved with silent suffering, an indelible scar left by the violence of a system that failed to deliver the justice they hoped for. Alan Gore, forever imprisoned by the repercussions of his romantic choices and the adulterous affair that acted as the spark that ignited the fire, had to carry the invisible weight of guilt, surviving the tragedy while knowing that his personal decisions had unwittingly led to the fatal collision between the two women in his life. The passage of time, far from erasing the outlines of this story, has only further cemented it in popular culture, transforming it into an essential case study for criminologists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts worldwide, who continue to dissect every detail, every motive, every piece of physical evidence, and every argument in an attempt to unravel the impenetrable mystery of what truly went through Candy Montgomery's mind that morning. The books, documentaries, and television series that have chronicled this case over the decades bear witness to our morbid yet profoundly human fascination with those moments when civilization teeters on the brink of savagery, when the most mundane normality suddenly collides with the most macabre extraordinary, compelling us to look in the mirror and ask ourselves how we would have reacted to such a tempest of destructive passions. Ultimately, the story of Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore leaves us with an uncomfortable truth. The dividing line between the reassuring normality of our well-ordered lives and the absolute chaos of a barbaric crime is infinitely thinner than we care to admit, hanging by a thread, the fragility of our secrets, the strength of our repressions, and our collective capacity to wear a mask to conceal the abysses of our own complexity. The echoes of that June day in 1980 continue to resonate through the ages as a solemn warning about the dangers of emotional isolation, the ravages of deception, and the absolute necessity of heeding the silent cries of those who suffer behind the pristine facades of our tranquil suburbs, forever reminding us that Wiley's story is not merely one of an extraordinary murder and trial, but a dark and fascinating mirror reflecting the unfathomable depths of the human condition. As the decades have quietly slipped away since that fateful summer morning in 1980, the chilling echoes of the Wiley axe murder case have refused to fade into the background of forgotten history, instead cementing themselves as a permanent, unsettling fixture in the annals of American true crime. When we step back to examine the totality of the tragedy, looking beyond the sensationalism of the trial headlines, the dramatic courtroom theatrics, and the subsequent cinematic adaptations, we are left to confront a much deeper, more disturbing truth about the fragile architecture of human society. The story of Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore is not merely an isolated anomaly, a bizarre aberration that occurred by chance in a sleepy Texan suburb. Rather, it serves as a profound and unsettling mirror reflecting the hidden fractures, the unspoken pressures, and the silent desperation that can fester beneath the most immaculate and polished surfaces of ordinary life. In the years following the verdict, as the original participants scattered to the winds and attempted to rebuild shattered existences under assumed names and in distant states, the town of Wiley itself had to undergo a painful process of collective healing and reinvention, forever marked by the realization that the idyllic peace they cherished was capable of harboring such unimaginable violence. The community learned the hard way that evil does not always announce itself with a menacing snarl or a stranger's footsteps in the dark. Sometimes, it wears the comfortable, familiar face of a trusted friend, steps through the front door in broad daylight, and leaves behind a legacy of eternal grief from which there is no waking up. The psychological footprint of this case extends far beyond the borders of Texas, resonating deeply with anyone who has ever felt trapped by the crushing weight of societal expectations. Both Betty and Candy, in their own contrasting ways, were products of an era and a social structure that demanded absolute perfection from women, relegating them to rigid roles as dutiful wives, immaculate housekeepers, and self-sacrificing mothers while offering little to no outlet for their genuine emotional turmoil, existential doubts, or deep-seated frustrations. Betty's desperate need to preserve the sanctity of her traditional family unit and Candy's restless rebellion against the suffocating monotony of suburban domesticity collided in that narrow utility room with a catastrophic force that ultimately destroyed them both. One physically, taking her last breath under a barrage of savage blows, and the other socially and morally, condemned forever by the court of public opinion despite walking out of the courthouse a legally free woman. This collision of repressed desires and unexpressed pains highlights a universal vulnerability that touches upon the human condition itself, the terrifying capacity for ordinary individuals, pushed to psychological breaking points by their own internal conflicts and the unbearable weight of keeping up appearances, to cross an invisible threshold and plunge headfirst into the abyss of absolute savagery. It is this precise realization that continues to captivate and terrify true crime enthusiasts, psychologists, and legal scholars alike, because it forces us to look past the monstrous acts and recognize the fragile, all too human frailties that preceded them, prompting the deeply uncomfortable question of how any of us might react if placed under a similarly crushing confluence of pressure, betrayal, and despair. From a legal and judicial standpoint, the legacy of the Candy Montgomery trial remains one of the most fiercely debated and controversial chapters in American jurisprudence. The successful deployment of the self-defense argument coupled with the radical psychiatric theory of a dissociative state triggered by a simple chuchotment or a repressed childhood trauma open up a Pandora's box of philosophical and ethical dilemmas within the legal system. Critics then and now have argued that accepting a state of temporary, hypnotic dissociation as a complete absolution for 41 devastating axe strikes, 28 of which were delivered to the head and face of a living, breathing woman, establishes a deeply troubling precedent, one that seemingly allows the sheer brutality of an overkill to be rationalized away by sophisticated psychological narratives. It raises profound questions about the limits of human accountability, the malleability of memory under hypnosis, and the dangerous potential for expert witnesses to construct elaborate justifications for acts of extreme violence. For the legal community, the case stands as a permanent cautionary tale about the intersection of modern psychology and criminal defense, illustrating how a brilliant legal strategy can successfully navigate the gray areas of the law to achieve a verdict that, while legally binding, remains profoundly unsatisfying to a public seeking basic moral justice. The acquittal did not restore balance to the universe. Rather, it left a gaping void of accountability, ensuring that the debate over what truly happened in that house on June 13th would rage on indefinitely in classrooms, courtrooms, and living rooms across the nation. Yet, amidst the complex legal arguments, the psychiatric jargon, and the sensationalized media coverage, it is vitally important that we never lose sight of the true human cost at the heart of this tragedy. Betty Gore was a living, breathing woman who loved her children, dedicated her professional life to nurturing the minds of young students, and sought nothing more out of life than a quiet, secure home where she could feel safe and cherished. Her brutal, agonizing end in the quiet confines of her own laundry room was an act of unspeakable cruelty that robbed her of her future, her children of their mother, and a family of their foundational pillar. The fact that her life was snuffed out in such a violent manner, and that the legal system ultimately failed to hold anyone criminally accountable for her murder, remains a heartbreaking injustice that time cannot easily heal. Her children, growing up in the heavy shadow of a notorious crime and an unpunished perpetrator, carried an invisible burden of sorrow and confusion throughout their lives, forced to navigate the complexities of their mother's horrific death, while the rest of the world turned the tragedy into a piece of entertainment or a legal curiosity. Alan Gore, too, lived out his days haunted by the quiet ghosts of his own choices, knowing intimately that his clandestine affair had served as the invisible match that ignited the powder keg, forever binding his name to a narrative of betrayal, blood, and irredeemable loss. As we reflect on the broader cultural impact of the Wiley axe murder case, we can observe how it prefigured our modern cultural obsession with true crime narratives, serving as an early archetype for the stories that now dominate our podcasts, documentaries, and streaming platforms. We are drawn to these dark tales not merely out of a morbid curiosity for gore and shock value, but because they offer a safe distance from which we can explore our deepest anxieties about safety, trust, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. The story of Candy and Betty strips away the polished veneer of modern comfort to reveal the primal chaos lurking just beneath the surface, reminding us that civilization is a thin veneer upheld by fragile agreements and shared trust. When those agreements are shattered by infidelity, deception, and unspoken rage, the descent into darkness can be astonishingly swift and absolute. Wylie, Texas, in 1980, became the crucible in which these dark truths were tested, exposing the vulnerabilities of a community that believed it was uniquely insulated from the evils of the wider world. The houses may have been well maintained, the lawns perfectly manicured, and the church pews filled with smiling faces, but beneath it all, human beings were struggling, breaking, and ultimately destroying one another in ways that defied comprehension. In the final analysis, the story of the 41 axe blows leaves us standing in a profound, contemplative silence, much like the quiet that descended upon the Gore household after the police lights had faded and the reporters had packed away their cameras. It is a silence filled with unanswered questions, lingering doubts, and a chilling awareness of the dark potentials that sleep quietly within the human heart. Candy Montgomery vanished into the anonymity of another state, attempting to reinvent herself as a counselor of troubled souls while carrying the indelible stain of her past, while Betty Gore rests eternally beneath a marker that bears witness to a life cut tragically short by the hands of a friend. The winds of the Texas plains continue to sweep across the quiet streets of Wylie, carrying the whispers of a history that refuses to be completely buried by the passage of time. For anyone who listens closely to the echoes of that fateful Friday morning, the lesson remains as stark and uncompromising as it was decades ago. We can never truly know what secrets are harbored behind closed doors, nor can we predict when the carefully constructed illusions of our peaceful lives will shatter, revealing the terrifying, unyielding reality of the human abyss that dwells just beneath the surface of our most ordinary days. As we draw the final curtain on this exhaustive examination of the 1980 Wylie tragedy, we are left standing at the precipice of an enduring mystery that continues to defy simple categorization or easy moral resolution. The narrative of Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore has transcended its origins as a localized Texas tragedy to become a permanent cultural touchstone, a dark mirror reflecting the deepest complexities, contradictions, and hidden vulnerabilities of the human experience. Throughout this journey into the heart of suburban darkness, we have navigated the meticulous preparations of ordinary lives, the sudden eruption of unspeakable violence in a quiet utility room, the frantic twists of a high-stakes police investigation, and the unprecedented legal gymnastics of a courtroom battle that stunned a nation. Yet, even as the legal proceedings concluded with a controversial verdict of acquittal and the participants scattered to the far corners of the country to rebuild whatever fragments remained of their lives, the core questions surrounding that fateful Friday afternoon remain as sharp, persistent, and unyielding as they were more than 4 decades ago. What drives an apparently normal individual to cross the absolute boundary into extreme and bloody physical carnage today, right now? To answer such profound questions, we must look beyond the immediate facts of the crime scene and delve into the sociological framework of the era. The suburban dream sold to families during the post-war decades was built upon an unspoken contract of conformity, stability, and emotional suppression. Individuals were expected to maintain pristine facades, suppressing any internal discord, marital dissatisfaction, or personal anxieties in order to project an image of serene success. When those artificial barriers are stressed by infidelity, fear, and unmet emotional needs, the resulting pressure cooker environment can generate unprecedented psychological stress. Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery were trapped within this rigid cultural paradigm, each seeking fulfillment or security in ways that ultimately collided with catastrophic results. Betty sought the anchor of a traditional family, while Candy sought escape from the crushing boredom of domestic routine through clandestine affairs. When their worlds violently intersected, the accumulated weight of months of deception and unexpressed pain detonated with a force that shattered their community forever. It is a stark reminder that societal pressures can forge invisible prisons for those who strive hardest to meet impossible and demanding social standards every single day of their lives right now here. Consider also the role of the legal system in this extraordinary drama. The courtroom battles of 1980 pushed the boundaries of criminal defense into uncharted territory by introducing complex psychiatric hypotheses to explain horrific physical violence. The defense team took a tremendous gamble by leaning into the concept of a dissociative state, suggesting that a repressed childhood trauma could transform a mild-mannered housewife into an unyielding force of destruction during a life-or-death struggle. While this defense successfully persuaded a jury of peers to grant an acquittal, it simultaneously created an ethical chasm that modern legal scholars continue to debate with fierce passion. If intense psychological trauma and temporary loss of conscious awareness can legally justify 41 devastating axe blows, where do we draw the line between criminal accountability and psychological absolution? This question strikes at the very core of our justice system, challenging our fundamental assumptions about free will, intent, and moral responsibility. The verdict left a permanent scar on the landscape of jurisprudence, proving that the law is often an imperfect instrument when forced to measure the dark, invisible corridors of the human mind in every single courtroom across the entire land today here. Beyond the courtroom drama and the sociological implications, we must also return our thoughts to the human beings whose lives were irrevocably shattered by these events. Betty Gore remains the true tragic figure of this narrative, a woman whose aspirations were modest and whose dedication to her students and her family defined her existence. Her violent end in the laundry room is a sobering reminder of how quickly a life can be extinguished by the sudden convergence of jealousy and rage. She did not live to defend her name or to share her side of the story in full, leaving her legacy to be interpreted through the cold medical reports of forensic pathologists and the heated arguments of defense attorneys. Her children grew up carrying an invisible sorrow, navigating a world stripped of maternal warmth and burdened by the heavy notoriety of their mother's death. Alan Gore, too, walked a lonely path of silent remorse, forever conscious that his private choices served as the inadvertent catalyst for a public catastrophe. These lives, caught in the relentless machinery of fate and human error, remind us that behind every sensational headline lies a profound, irreparable human grief unfolding right before us today. The enduring fascination with the Candy Montgomery case also sheds light on our collective psychological relationship with true crime as a genre. In our modern society, we consume tales of violence and betrayal with an insatiable appetite, turning dark historical events into entertainment through podcasts, documentaries, and dramatic series. This cultural obsession stems from a deep-seated psychological need to examine our darkest fears from a position of relative safety. By dissecting the catastrophic failures of others, we attempt to construct a protective barrier around our own lives, convincing ourselves that we can recognize the warning signs, avoid similar pitfalls, and maintain control over our destinies. Yet, the true lesson of Wiley is precisely the opposite. It teaches us that disaster often strikes without warning, bypassing our carefully laid plans and shattering our illusions of total security. The descent from a peaceful suburban afternoon into an abyss of blood and horror can happen in a matter of minutes, leaving us to wonder how well we truly know the people standing right beside us in the daylight hours of our everyday lives, moving forward through time and space right now in this fascinating world we all share today with everyone here. As we reflect upon the aftermath, we see how Candy Montgomery attempted to bury her past by fleeing to another state and seeking a fresh start in professional counseling. The irony of a woman who unleashed such catastrophic violence, spending her subsequent years guiding troubled souls through emotional crises, is a detail that continues to boggle the imagination. It highlights the remarkable resilience, or perhaps the chilling compartmentalization, of the human psyche. She managed to carve out a new existence in Georgia, shedding her old identity while the ghosts of Wiley remained anchored to the Texas plains. Meanwhile, the town itself slowly moved forward, its residents repairing the fabric of their community life while maintaining a quiet, permanent awareness of the darkness that had once pierced their sanctuary. Time eventually softens the sharpest edges of public outrage, transforming raw trauma into historical lore, yet the fundamental unease generated by the trial never truly dissipates. It lingers in the background like a low-frequency hum, reminding anyone willing to listen that the veneer of civilization is extraordinarily thin across every suburban neighborhood found anywhere in the modern world we inhabit together on this planet, right now, today, here in our time. The legacy of this 1980 case also lives on through popular culture, inspiring numerous books, television films, and streaming miniseries that bring the chilling details to new generations of viewers. These dramatizations serve a dual purpose, acting both as gripping entertainment and as cautionary tales about the destructive power of unexpressed resentment and suburban isolation. They compel us to peer behind closed doors and question the untruths we tell ourselves and others to maintain social harmony. Yet, no matter how many times the story is adapted for the screen, the core mystery remains entirely intact, guarded by the silent testimony of the Texas soil and the lingering shadows of a small-town courtroom. The 41 axe blows will forever echo in the annals of true crime history as a monument to human frailty, a stark reminder of what happens when private deceptions collide with uncontainable fury. We are left humbled by the realization that some questions will never find satisfactory answers, and that the human heart remains an unfathomable labyrinth of light and shadow stretching out across all human experience, now and forever throughout the vast expanses of our shared history from this day forward right here today. As we conclude our series on this haunting piece of American criminal history, we offer our deepest remembrance to Betty Gore and her family, whose lives were altered beyond recognition on that summer morning. The silence that now settles over the memory of Wiley is a heavy one, filled with the ghosts of a tragedy that could never be fully explained away by psychology or exonerated by a verdict. We step back into our own lives, leaving behind the dark streets of Texas, carrying with us the lingering weight of a story that challenges everything we think we know about safety, friendship, and the dark corners of the soul. Thank you for joining us on this deep and unsettling exploration into the shadows of human nature. This has been an in-depth look at the Wiley tragedy, reminding us all to remain vigilant, compassionate, and acutely aware of the fragile worlds we build around ourselves every single day. Until we meet again to uncover another dark chapter from the past, stay safe, keep questioning the world around you, and remember that even in the brightest sunlight, the deepest shadows can sometimes be found right at your own front doorstep. As the years march relentlessly forward into the mid-21st century, the shadow cast by the events of that fateful June day in 1980 continues to stretch across the collective memory of modern society, transforming a localized suburban tragedy into an enduring sociological and cultural milestone of monumental proportions. When we look back at the labyrinthine twists and turns of the Candy Montgomery case, we are inevitably struck by how profoundly it anticipated the contemporary obsession with true crime, forensic psychology, and the dark underbelly of domestic life. Long before the era of prestige television miniseries, viral internet sleuths, and around-the-clock podcast investigations, the quiet town of Wiley, Texas, served as the ultimate crucible for a national conversation about the hidden stresses of middle-class existence, the structural limits of the legal system, and the terrifying elasticity of human morality when individuals are pushed to their absolute breaking point. The narrative has evolved from a shocking local news headline into a permanent fixture of our cultural folklore, inviting endless re-examinations from new generations of writers, legal experts, and psychologists who continue to grapple with the unsettling ambiguities left behind by that unforgettable courtroom verdict. It is a story that refuses to rest quietly in the deep archives of the past because it touches upon fundamental human anxieties that remain just as potent today as they were over 4 decades ago, reminding us with uncompromising clarity that the veneer of civilization is perpetually thin and that the very darkness we fear most is often hiding right next door in plain sight. The cultural resonance of the Wiley axe murder lies largely in its unique ability to subvert our most deeply ingrained assumptions about safety, gender roles, and community solidarity. In the traditional cultural imagination, extreme violence is almost invariably conceptualized as an external threat, an unnatural aberration introduced by a dangerous stranger, or a shadowy intruder breaking the sacred physical boundaries of the home under the cover of night. Yet, the tragedy of Betty Gore shattered this comforting illusion once and for all by revealing with chilling precision that the most devastating horrors can be conceived and executed within the warm, sunlit confines of a suburban kitchen, perpetrated by someone who shared recipes, attended church services, and exchanged friendly pleasantries over backyard fences. This profound betrayal of trust leaves a lingering psychological residue that fundamentally affects how we perceive our neighbors, our closest friendships, and the hidden realities of domestic spaces. We are compelled to ask ourselves deeply uncomfortable questions about what secrets might be festering behind closed doors in our own neighborhoods, and how well we truly know the people with whom we share our daily routines and community lives. The case serves as an enduring cautionary tale about the immense dangers of emotional isolation, unexpressed resentment, and the crushing societal pressures that demand flawless perfection at the expense of authentic emotional expression and mental well-being. Both Betty and Candy were trapped within a rigid cultural matrix that offered no safe, constructive outlet for their vulnerabilities, creating a volatile pressure cooker environment where a private dispute over an illicit affair could escalate into an unimaginable catastrophe of blood and steel. From the perspective of legal history and jurisprudence, the fallout from the trial continues to generate intense, passionate debate among scholars of criminal law and defense strategy. The successful deployment of the self-defense argument, anchored by the controversial introduction of psychiatric theories regarding dissociative states and repressed childhood trauma, established a deeply contentious precedent that still haunts legal classrooms and academic discussions today. Critics argue with great fervor that utilizing a temporary psychological blackout to excuse 41 devastating acts strikes opens a dangerous legal door where extreme brutality can be rationalized away through sophisticated medical narratives, effectively bypassing traditional notions of individual criminal accountability. It forces us to confront the profound difficulty of measuring intent and moral responsibility when the human mind fractures under extreme emotional and physical stress. The jury in 1980 was placed in an extraordinarily difficult and unenviable position, forced to weigh raw emotional horror against complex psychiatric hypotheses, ultimately choosing to grant an acquittal that left a permanent fracture in the public perception of justice. This unresolved tension is precisely why the case continues to be dissected in law journals and true crime analyses, as it forces a perpetual reevaluation of how the legal system interacts with the dark, hidden corridors of human psychology. It reminds us with sobering force that justice is not always a neat, satisfying equation, and that the courtroom can sometimes deliver verdicts that leave society grappling with a profound sense of moral disorientation and deep societal unease. Beyond the cold legal arguments and the broad sociological implications, the human dimension of the tragedy remains its most deeply haunting and enduring aspect. The memory of Betty Gore, a dedicated elementary school teacher, a loving mother, and a woman who sought nothing more out of life than peace and security, is preserved not just in the clinical forensic reports of investigators, but in the enduring sorrow of her family and loved ones who bore the invisible scars of her violent end. The children who grew up without a maternal presence, the husband who lived with the quiet, crushing weight of his choices, and the friends whose world was upended in a single morning all represent the tragic collateral damage of a cataclysm born from infidelity and uncontained fury. Their experiences remind us with heartbreaking clarity that sensationalized true crime narratives always originate from real human suffering, and that behind every historical headline lies an irreparable loss that time can never fully heal. As the decades pass, the urgency of the initial public outrage may soften into historical curiosity, but the fundamental gravity of the loss remains entirely undiminished, demanding that we approach these dark chapters with empathy, sobriety, and a deep respect for the lives that were so abruptly cut short. The legacy of Betty Gore deserves to be remembered not merely as a footnote in a sensational trial, but as a poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating human cost of hidden betrayals that happen everywhere. The ongoing fascination with the case in contemporary media, ranging from comprehensive investigative books to high-profile streaming adaptations and documentaries, demonstrates our collective need to process these dark themes through structured storytelling. We consume these complex narratives because they provide a safe, psychological distance from which we can confront our own deepest fears about betrayal, vulnerability, and the unpredictable nature of human impulse. By examining the catastrophic failures of the past, we subconsciously seek to immunize ourselves against similar disasters, searching for warning signs and psychological red flags that might protect us from the unforeseen storms of life. Yet, the enduring lesson of Wiley is precisely that such disasters often defy easy prediction, arriving with the suddenness of a summer storm and shattering our carefully constructed illusions of control and safety. The descent from an ordinary suburban afternoon into an abyss of violence is a terrifying reminder of how quickly our shared agreements can collapse when exposed to the corrosive power of deception and unbridled rage. It challenges us to look beyond surface-level perfection and recognize the complex, fragile humanity that exists within everyone we encounter in our daily lives. Through these cultural retellings, the events of 1980 remain relevant, serving as a powerful mirror for our own anxieties and a continuous exploration of the dark corners of the human condition that unites us all. As we contemplate the full scope of this historical tragedy, we are left standing in a contemplative silence that echoes across the vast Texas plains. The town of Wiley has long since moved forward, its streets continuing their quiet rhythms beneath the southwestern sky, yet the ghosts of 1980 remain permanently anchored to its legacy. Candy Montgomery faded into the anonymity of another state, attempting to rebuild her life far away from the glaring lights of media scrutiny, while Betty Gore rests eternally beneath a marker that bears silent witness to a life interrupted by unimaginable cruelty. The 41 axe blows continue to resonate as a stark monument to human frailty, a haunting reminder of the dark potentials that sleep quietly within the human heart when an individual is pushed past their psychological limits. We step away from this exhaustive exploration with a renewed awareness of the delicate balance upon which our daily lives are suspended, carrying forward the lessons of a story that challenges everything we think we know about safety, trust, and the hidden depths of the soul. Thank you for journeying through this profound examination of one of America's most unsettling true crime mysteries, a narrative that will undoubtedly continue to captivate, horrify, and instruct generations to come as we navigate the complex, shadowed corridors of our shared human experience. May the memory of those lost serve as a guiding light reminding us to cherish our connections, communicate with honesty, and remain ever vigilant against the hidden shadows that dwell within our own minds. As we arrive at the ultimate contemplation of this sprawling, intricate, and deeply unsettling narrative, we find ourselves suspended between the historical reality of a brutal Texas summer and the timeless, universal questions that define the human condition. The story of Wiley, of Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore, is not merely a dark chapter to be filed away in the dusty cabinets of judicial history. It is a living, breathing testament to the unpredictable fragility of our existence. When we trace the path from those sunlit suburban streets of 1980 to the quiet reflections of the present day, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that the most profound horrors often emerge not from the grand, chaotic battles of nations, but from the quiet, suffocating corners of domestic life where human beings struggle desperately against their own invisible demons. The passage of time has done little to dull the sharp edges of this mystery. If anything, the ensuing decades have only deepened the shadows, allowing us to examine the intricate mechanics of the tragedy with a clearer, albeit sobering, perspective. We look back across the years not with the breathless sensationalism that initially gripped the media, but with a quiet, solemn reverence for the gravity of what transpired behind closed doors in that quiet laundry room, recognizing that the echoes of those 41 axe blows continue to resonate deeply within the collective conscience of modern society. To fully grasp the enduring significance of this case, we must continually return to the subtle, often overlooked architecture of suburban conformity that set the stage for disaster. The promise of suburban life during that era was built upon an uncompromising foundation of emotional containment, where individuals were expected to suppress their internal turmoils, mask their marital disappointments, and project an unyielding image of serene, flawless success to the outside world. This relentless cultural demand for perfection created invisible prisons for countless individuals who found themselves trapped between the rigid expectations of their community and the raw, messy reality of their own human frailties. Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery were both products of this demanding matrix, navigating the silent pressures of motherhood, marriage, and social standing in ways that ultimately led them on a tragic collision course. Betty sought the anchor of a traditional family, clutching desperately to the sanctity of her home as a protective fortress against an uncertain world, while Candy sought an escape from the profound monotony of domestic routine through clandestine pursuits that tore at the fragile fabric of her social circle. When their worlds finally intersected in that narrow, sunlit hallway, the accumulated weight of unexpressed pain, jealousy, and deception detonated with catastrophic fury. It stands as a chilling reminder of how dangerous the suppression of human emotion can be, illustrating how the walls we build to protect our secrets can ultimately become the very tombs in which our peace is buried forever. The legal and philosophical aftershocks of the trial continue to ripple through academic halls and courtrooms, serving as a permanent flashpoint for debates concerning moral accountability and the limits of criminal justice. The introduction of complex psychiatric theories, proposing that a repressed childhood trauma and a momentary auditory trigger could plunge an individual into an involuntary dissociative state during a life-or-death struggle, fundamentally challenged traditional legal doctrines regarding intent and free will. When a jury of peers accepted this defense and granted an acquittal in the face of overwhelming physical evidence of extreme violence, they established a controversial precedent that still divides legal scholars today. This profound tension between legal exoneration and moral culpability leaves a lasting scar on our perception of justice, demonstrating that the legal system is often an imperfect, blunt instrument when tasked with navigating the dark, unfathomable corridors of human psychology. It forces us to ask difficult questions about where the boundary lies between individual responsibility and psychological absolution, reminding us that a verdict delivered within the walls of a courtroom does not always align with the deeper, intuitive sense of justice held by the broader community. The unresolved nature of that verdict ensures that the debate will endure, serving as an eternal cautionary tale about the perils of intertwining modern psychiatric defense strategies with brutal, premeditated or reactive acts of physical destruction. Yet, amidst the complex legal abstractions and the swirling sociological analyses, we must never lose sight of the profound human cost that remains at the very heart of this tragedy. Betty Gore was not merely a central figure in a sensational true crime drama. She was a living, breathing person who cherished her children, dedicated her professional life to nurturing young minds, and sought nothing more from the world than a secure, loving home where she could feel safe and valued. Her brutal and agonizing end in the quiet confines of her own house was an act of unspeakable cruelty that robbed her of her future and left an irreparable void in the lives of those who loved her most. The children who grew up without their mother's warmth, bearing the heavy, unchosen notoriety of her death, and the husband who navigated a lifetime of silent remorse, knowing his private choices acted as the unwitting catalyst for disaster, represent the true, tragic victims of that fateful Friday. Their enduring sorrow reminds us that behind every headline, every podcast episode, and every cinematic retelling lies a sacred human grief that time cannot simply erase. It demands that we approach these historical tragedies not as mere entertainment or intellectual puzzles to be solved, but with profound empathy, sober reflection, and an unwavering respect for the lives that were so violently cut short before their time. Our collective, insatiable fascination with true crime as a cultural phenomenon reveals a deep-seated psychological need to confront our darkest fears from a position of relative safety and detached observation. By consuming narratives of betrayal, violence, and suburban collapse, we subconsciously attempt to build a protective barrier around our own fragile lives, searching for warning signs and psychological red flags that might immunize us against the unforeseen tempests of human impulse. We want to believe that disaster is something that happens only to distant strangers, that we can somehow read the signs and maintain absolute control over our destinies without ever facing true chaos. Yet, the enduring lesson of Wiley is precisely the opposite. It teaches us that catastrophe can strike without warning, bypassing our most carefully laid plans and shattering our illusions of total security in a matter of moments. The descent from an ordinary summer afternoon into an abyss of blood and chaos is a terrifying testament to how fragile our shared social agreements truly are. It challenges us to look beyond surface-level perfection and recognize the complex, trembling humanity that exists within everyone we encounter along the path of our daily lives, reminding us that the veneer of civilization is extraordinarily thin and easily fractured when exposed to the corrosive power of deceit and unbridled rage. As we finally bring this comprehensive, exhaustive exploration of the 1980 Wiley tragedy to a close, we stand in a reflective, contemplative silence that stretches across the vast plains of Texas and echoes throughout the corridors of our shared human history. The town of Wiley has long since moved forward, its streets continuing their quiet rhythms beneath the expansive southwestern sky, yet the ghosts of that summer day remain permanently anchored to its legacy. Candy Montgomery slipped away into the anonymity of another state, attempting to reinvent her existence far from the glaring lights of public scrutiny, while Betty Gore rests eternally beneath a marker that bears silent witness to a life interrupted by unimaginable cruelty. The 41 axe blows continue to resonate as a stark, unyielding monument to human frailty, a haunting reminder of the dark potentials that sleep quietly within the human heart when an individual is pushed past their psychological breaking point. We step away from this deep and unsettling journey with a renewed awareness of the delicate balance upon which our daily lives are suspended, carrying forward the profound lessons of a story that challenges everything we think we know about safety, trust, and the hidden depths of the soul. Thank you for walking with us through these shadowed corridors of the past, examining the complexities of a case that will undoubtedly continue to captivate, horrify, and instruct generations to come across the globe. May the memory of those lost serve as a gentle, guiding light reminding us to cherish our connections, communicate with absolute honesty, and remain ever vigilant against the hidden shadows that dwell within our own minds, ensuring that we look closely at our world with compassion and care as we navigate the vast, unpredictable expanses of our shared human journey from this day forward into the future. As we venture even further into the profound and multifaceted aftermath of the 1980 Wiley tragedy, we find ourselves compelled to confront the deeper philosophical and existential layers that continue to elevate this case far beyond a standard historical true crime narrative. The chilling events that transpired within that quiet suburban laundry room on a sweltering Friday morning have long since ceased to be merely a local judicial anomaly. Instead, they have evolved into a monumental touchstone for our collective understanding of human nature, societal pressure, and the terrifying elasticity of moral boundaries. When we strip away the sensational headlines, the dramatic courtroom theatrics, and the slick cinematic dramatizations that have populated our screens over the decades, we are left standing face to face with the raw, unsettling reality of human vulnerability. The story of Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore forces us to question the very foundations of the civilized structures we painstakingly build around ourselves, exposing the precarious balance between our outward projections of harmony and the hidden, turbulent depths of our inner emotional worlds. It is a narrative that challenges our deepest assumptions about safety, trust, and community, reminding us that the darkest tragedies often germinate not in the chaotic underbelly of distant urban metropolises, but in the serene, sunlit sanctuaries of middle-class domesticity, where individuals strive desperately to maintain an immaculate facade of perfection against insurmountable odds. The enduring power of this historical case lies in its uncanny ability to mirror the silent, suffocating struggles that countless individuals experience behind closed doors, navigating the rigid expectations of a society that demands compliance, emotional suppression, and relentless optimism. During the post-war suburban boom, communities like Wiley were intentionally constructed as utopian havens, insulated spaces designed to protect families from the unpredictable dangers of the outside world through the comforting rhythms of church participation, neighborly cooperation, and predictable domestic routines. Yet, this very insulation often created an invisible, stifling pressure cooker environment where any deviation from the accepted norm was met with quiet ostracization or internal shame. Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery were both trapped within this demanding cultural matrix, each attempting to reconcile their personal desires, anxieties, and profound dissatisfactions with the inflexible demands of their social roles. Betty sought the ultimate security of a traditional family unit, clinging to the sanctity of her home as an impenetrable fortress against her internal fears, while Candy sought an escape from the crushing monotony of domestic routine through clandestine pursuits that ultimately tore at the very fabric of her community. When their suppressed realities violently collided in that narrow hallway, the resulting catastrophe was not merely an explosion of individual rage, but a systemic failure of a culture that provided no safe, constructive outlets for human frailty, emotional pain, or marital discord. This profound systemic and psychological disconnect inevitably spills over into our ongoing fascination with the legal and ethical dimensions of the trial itself. The courtroom battle of 1980 remains a fascinating, albeit deeply troubling, watershed moment in the history of American jurisprudence, primarily because it dared to bridge the gap between criminal accountability and modern psychiatric theory. By introducing the controversial hypothesis of a dissociative state triggered by repressed childhood trauma and a momentary auditory trigger, the defense team successfully persuaded a jury of peers to accept that extreme, catastrophic physical violence could be executed in a state of complete unconscious awareness and involuntary panic. This legal maneuver opened a Pandora's box of philosophical dilemmas that continue to provoke fierce debate among legal scholars, ethicists, and criminologists today. If 41 devastating axe strikes, delivered with chilling precision to the head and body of a living, breathing woman, can be legally rationalized away as the unfortunate byproduct of a temporary psychological blackout, we are forced to re-examine the very essence of moral responsibility and free will. It challenges us to consider where the boundary truly lies between individual agency and psychological determinism, leaving a lingering unease that the legal system can sometimes manipulate the complexities of the human mind to achieve verdicts that leave the broader community grappling with a profound sense of moral disorientation and unfinished justice. Yet, amidst the complex theoretical frameworks, the psychiatric jargon, and the sensationalized media analyses, we must never allow ourselves to lose sight of the genuine human suffering that remains the core tragedy of this narrative. Betty Gore was a living, breathing person who brought warmth to her classroom, love to her children, and a quiet dignity to her everyday existence. Her brutal and agonizing end in the quiet confines of her own home was an act of unspeakable cruelty that robbed her of her future, her children of their maternal anchor, and her family of their foundational pillar. The fact that her life was extinguished in such a violent manner, and that the legal system ultimately failed to hold anyone criminally accountable for her murder through a traditional conviction, remains a heartbreaking injustice that time can never truly heal. Her children, growing up in the heavy shadow of a notorious crime and an unpunished perpetrator, carried an invisible burden of sorrow and confusion throughout their lives, forced to navigate the complexities of their mother's horrific death, while the rest of the world turned the tragedy into an intellectual curiosity or a piece of entertainment. Alan Gore, too, lived out his days haunted by the quiet ghosts of his own choices, knowing intimately that his clandestine affair had served as the invisible match that ignited the powder keg, forever binding his name to a narrative of betrayal, blood, and irredeemable loss. Our collective, insatiable appetite for true crime as a cultural phenomenon reveals a deep-seated psychological need to confront our darkest fears from a position of relative safety and detached observation. By consuming narratives of betrayal, violence, and suburban collapse, we subconsciously attempt to build a protective barrier around our own fragile lives, searching for warning signs and psychological red flags that might immunize us against the unforeseen tempests of human impulse. We want to believe that disaster is something that happens only to distant strangers, that we can somehow read the signs and maintain absolute control over our destinies without ever facing true chaos. Yet, the enduring lesson of Wiley is precisely the opposite. It teaches us that catastrophe can strike without warning, bypassing our most carefully laid plans and shattering our illusions of total security in a matter of moments. The descent from an ordinary summer afternoon into an abyss of blood and chaos is a terrifying testament to how fragile our shared social agreements truly are. It challenges us to look beyond surface-level perfection and recognize the complex, trembling humanity that exists within everyone we encounter along the path of our daily lives, reminding us that the veneer of civilization is extraordinarily thin and easily fractured when exposed to the corrosive power of deceit and unbridled rage. As we finally bring this comprehensive, exhaustive exploration of the 1980 Wiley tragedy to a close, we stand in a reflective, contemplative silence that stretches across the vast plains of Texas and echoes throughout the corridors of our shared human history. The town of Wiley has long since moved forward, its streets continuing their quiet rhythms beneath the expansive southwestern sky, yet the ghosts of that summer day remain permanently anchored to its legacy. Candy Montgomery slipped away into the anonymity of another state, attempting to reinvent her existence far from the glaring lights of public scrutiny, while Betty Gore rests eternally beneath a marker that bears silent witness to a life interrupted by unimaginable cruelty. The 41 axe blows continue to resonate as a stark, unyielding monument to human frailty, a haunting reminder of the dark potentials that sleep quietly within the human heart when an individual is pushed past their psychological breaking point. We step away from this deep and unsettling journey with a renewed awareness of the delicate balance upon which our daily lives are suspended, carrying forward the profound lessons of a story that challenges everything we think we know about safety, trust, and the hidden depths of the soul. Thank you for walking with us through these shadowed corridors of the past, examining the complexities of a case that will undoubtedly continue to captivate, horrify, and instruct generations to come across the globe. May the memory of those lost serve as a gentle, guiding light reminding us to cherish our connections, communicate with absolute honesty, and remain ever vigilant against the hidden shadows that dwell within our own minds, ensuring that we look closely at our world with compassion and care as we navigate the vast, unpredictable expanses of our shared human journey from this day forward into the future. As we finally arrive at the absolute horizon of this extensive, deeply contemplative, and emotionally taxing journey through the shadows of the 1980 Wiley tragedy, we find ourselves enveloped in a profound, reflective stillness that mirrors the quiet winds sweeping across the expansive Texas plains. The story of Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore has taken us far beyond the boundaries of a conventional true crime chronicle, transforming into an enduring, universal exploration of the darkest, most unfathomable recesses of the human psyche. Throughout these exhaustive reflections, we have peered behind the immaculate, sunlit veneer of suburban perfection to expose the fragile architecture of lives built upon unspoken secrets, repressed desires, and the crushing weight of societal expectations. We have walked the quiet, tree-lined streets of a community that believed itself uniquely insulated from the chaos of the wider world, only to discover that the most devastating storms often brew not in distant, lawless metropolises, but within the warm, inviting kitchens of our closest friends and trusted neighbors. The legacy of those 41 axe blows continues to reverberate across the decades, standing as a stark, unyielding monument to what happens when private deceptions collide with uncontainable fury, shattering forever the illusion that we can fully comprehend or predict the actions of those who stand beside us in the daylight hours of our ordinary lives. It is a legacy defined not merely by the sensationalism of courtroom theatrics or the intense controversy of a legally sanctioned acquittal, but by the lingering, unresolved questions of moral accountability, human frailty, and the haunting persistence of grief that time alone cannot entirely wash away. When we contemplate the ultimate meaning of the Wiley tragedy, we are compelled to look past the dramatic headlines and confront the sobering reality that civilization itself is sustained by a remarkably thin fabric of shared trust, mutual honesty, and emotional transparency. A fabric that can be violently torn apart in a matter of moments when individuals are pushed past their psychological breaking points by the relentless pressures of existence. The memory of Betty Gore remains enshrined within this narrative as a poignant reminder of a life cut tragically short, a woman whose quiet dignity, dedication to her students, and aspirations for a peaceful family home were extinguished in a flurry of incomprehensible violence, leaving behind a vacuum of sorrow that her children and loved ones carried through the remainder of their days. Her story demands that we approach historical true crime not as a source of cheap entertainment or intellectual amusement, but with a deep, abiding respect for the human suffering at its core, ensuring that the victims of such tragedies are never reduced to mere footnotes in a sensationalized legal drama. Meanwhile, the enigmatic figure of Candy Montgomery continues to occupy a complex, deeply unsettling space in our cultural consciousness, embodying the baffling dichotomy of a human being capable of projecting profound charm and social normalcy while simultaneously harboring the capacity for catastrophic, unbridled destruction. Her ability to slip away into the anonymity of another state, shedding her past and attempting to reinvent herself as a guide for troubled souls, serves as a chilling testament to the remarkable, almost incomprehensible compartmentalization of the human mind, illustrating how effortlessly a person can walk away from the wreckage of their own actions while the rest of the world continues to grapple with the seismic shockwaves left in their wake. The legal precedent established by her trial, where a jury of peers accepted a complex psychiatric narrative of dissociative panic to rationalize away extreme physical overkill, remains a permanent source of philosophical friction and ethical debate, challenging our fundamental understanding of justice, intent, and personal responsibility in a world where the boundary between sanity and madness is often terrifyingly blurred. As we delve even deeper into the philosophical implications of this historical enigma, we must also examine the evolving nature of how society processes collective trauma and moral ambiguity through the lens of modern storytelling, recognizing that our insatiable appetite for dark narratives is ultimately an expression of our profound psychological need to find order in chaos and security in uncertainty. The events of that fateful June morning in 1980 continue to serve as an indispensable lens through which we analyze the hidden fault lines of domestic life, reminding us that no amount of social standing, religious devotion, or material comfort can completely immunize a community against the destructive power of unexpressed resentment and emotional isolation. We see reflected in the mirror of Wiley not an alien monster, but an extreme manifestation of ordinary human flaws brought to a terrifying boiling point by the convergence of circumstance, betrayal, and psychological vulnerability. This realization is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire affair, because it strips away the comfortable illusion that evil is always foreign and easily identifiable, replacing it with the sobering truth that the potential for darkness resides quietly within the complex labyrinth of every human heart, waiting only for the right catalyst to breach the surface of our civilized existence. The passage of time, while softening the raw edges of public outrage, has only deepened the historical significance of the case, transforming it into an everlasting cautionary tale about the vital importance of open communication, emotional honesty, and the necessity of addressing human suffering before it metastasizes into irreversible tragedy. The town of Wiley itself has long since healed its visible wounds, moving forward beneath the vast Texas sky while holding onto a quiet, permanent awareness of the history that unfolded upon its soil, a history that reminds every resident and visitor alike of the profound responsibilities we owe to one another as members of a shared community. As we finally close the final chapter on this comprehensive exploration of the Wiley tragedy, we step away with a heightened awareness of the hidden depths that dwell within every human heart, carrying forward the solemn responsibility to remain vigilant, compassionate, and deeply attuned to the silent struggles of those around us. The echoes of that fateful summer morning will forever remind us to cherish the fragile connections we build with one another, to communicate with absolute honesty, and to confront the shadows of our own inner worlds before they have a chance to manifest into catastrophe. Thank you for walking alongside us through this profound and unsettling examination of human nature, history, and survival. May the lessons of the past serve as a guiding light as we navigate the unpredictable, ever-shifting landscapes of our own lives, remaining ever mindful of the delicate worlds we construct and the enduring power of truth in a world that is so often obscured by the polished surfaces of illusion, ensuring that the memory of Betty Gore lives on as a poignant reminder of our shared humanity, our shared vulnerabilities, and our enduring quest for light within the deepest shadows of the human soul. While we continue to look forward into the unfolding chapters of our collective existence with a renewed dedication to empathy, truth, and the preservation of the sacred bonds that connect us all across the fleeting expanses of time and space, recognizing that every story from the past carries within it a vital lesson for the future as we walk together through the complex, beautifully flawed tapestry of human experience now and forevermore throughout the countless days and years yet to come in this fascinating and unpredictable world we share.